12 Harleys rolled into a Tennessee courthouse on a Thursday morning so cold the exhaust froze midair like ghost breath. Leather cuts, prison tattoos, eyes that had seen combat zones and coffins. They weren't there to threaten anyone. They were there because a 13-year-old boy with bruised wrists and bare feet had walked through a rainstorm and knocked on the one door no sane person would approach, the Iron Vulture's clubhouse, and asked a room full of scarred, dangerous men the question that would shatter every wall they'd built around their hearts. Will any of you come to court with me? What happened next will haunt you. Stay with me until the very end of this story. I promise you, it's worth every second. If you're watching right now, hit that like button, drop a comment, and tell me what city you're tuning in from. Let's get into it. The rain didn't fall that night. It attacked. Sheets of ice water hammered the corrugated steel roof of the Iron Vulture's clubhouse like machine gun fire, rattling the windows in their warped frames and turning the gravel lot outside into a black river. November in Harlan County had teeth. It bit through walls, through leather, through bone. The kind of cold that reminded men they were mortal even when they spent most of their lives pretending otherwise. Inside, the clubhouse smelled like burnt coffee, wet leather, and the ghost of 1,000 cigarettes that had died against the rim of the same tin ashtray bolted to the bar. Neon beer signs threw pale blue and red across scarred wooden walls, covered in framed photographs. Nobody looked at anymore. Dead brothers, old rides, a version of the club that existed before funerals outnumbered parties. The jukebox in the corner had been broken for 3 months. Nobody fixed it. Nobody cared enough. Mac Mercer stood behind the bar wiping down whiskey glasses with a rag that needed washing 2 weeks ago. 51 years old. 6'2". 230 pounds of scar tissue, bad decisions, and the kind of silence that made people cross the street. His hands were enormous. Knuckles split so many times the skin had given up healing smooth, and his forearms carried faded Marine Corps ink that bled into newer tattoos marking every year he'd survived since discharge. President Patch on his cut. Sergeant-at-Arms mentality in his blood. He ran the Iron Vultures the way he ran his fire team in Fallujah. Quiet orders, zero tolerance, and the unshakable certainty that every man at the table would bleed for the brother beside him. But the table was half empty tonight. Roach sat in the corner booth sharpening a K-bar knife he never used for anything except peeling apples. 58. Ponytail gone silver. Vietnam-era ghost who never fully came home from the jungle and never pretended he did. He didn't talk much. When he did, people listened, because the alternative was watching those dead calm eyes decide you weren't worth the oxygen. Stitch leaned against the pool table reading a water-stained paperback, boots crossed at the ankles, reading glasses perched on a nose that had been broken 4 times. Club medic. Former Navy corpsman who lost his medical license to opioids and found his way back to sobriety through engine grease and stubbornness. Gentlest hands in the club, most haunted eyes. Jax, 29, wiry, restless, sat on the floor near the wood stove, taking apart a carburetor that didn't need taking apart. Youngest full patch. Anger issues stitched into his DNA like thread through leather. He'd done 18 months in county for assault before Mac pulled him out of a halfway house and handed him a wrench instead of a fist. Jack still woke up swinging most nights. But he was learning. Slowly. 4 men in a clubhouse built for 30. Tuesday night, dead season. The kind of emptiness that settled into the bones of an outlaw brotherhood when there was nothing to fight, nothing to fix, and nothing to outrun. Just the rain and the dark and the weight of years pressing down like a hand on the back of the neck. Mac set down the glass. Picked up another. The ritual meant nothing. It was just something to do with hands that had forgotten how to be still. Then came the knock. Not loud. Not aggressive. 3 soft impacts against the heavy oak door that barely cut through the storm noise. The kind of knock a person makes when they've already decided nobody will answer, but they're trying anyway because trying is the last thing they have left. Roach looked up from his knife. Jack stopped mid-turn on a bolt. Stitch closed his book without marking the page. Max stared at the door. Nobody knocked on the Iron Vulture's clubhouse at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. Not bill collectors. Not cops. Not rivals. The building sat at the dead end of a gravel road 2 miles outside Harlan proper, behind a rusted chain-link fence with no sign and no lights. You didn't find this place by accident. You found it because you were looking for something nobody else could give you, or because you were looking for trouble that would find you first. The knock came again, softer this time, almost apologetic. Mac walked around the bar. His boots hit the floor with the slow, measured rhythm of a man who hadn't hurried for anything in 15 years. He unbolted the deadlock, pulled the door open into the wind. Rain exploded inward. Cold air slammed his face like an open hand. And there, standing on the concrete step in the full violence of the storm, was a boy. 13 years old, maybe younger, hard to tell with the malnutrition hollowing his cheeks and the fear aging his eyes decades past, where they belonged. Barefoot, soaked through a gray hoodie 3 sizes too big that clung to a frame built from hunger and survival. His lips were blue. His hands shook at his sides. Water streamed off him in sheets, pooling on the concrete like the storm had followed him inside. He looked up at Mac with eyes that had seen things no child's eyes should hold. "Will—" His voice cracked. He swallowed. Tried again. "Will any of you come to court with me?" The clubhouse fell silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that happens when every man in a room stops breathing at the same time because the air has changed and something irreversible has just walked through the door. Mac didn't move. The rain hammered his shoulder where the door hung open. He stared down at the boy, at the trembling jaw, at the bruise circling the left wrist like a handprint pressed into wax, at the soaked papers clutched against his chest with fingers gone white from cold. "Get inside," Mac said. Not a question. Not an invitation. An order. The boy hesitated. His eyes swept the room behind Mac, the leather cuts, the tattoos, the knife in Roach's hand, the shadows stacked in every corner like warnings, and something flickered across his face. Not more fear. Recognition. The desperate, illogical recognition of a drowning person spotting a life raft made of razor wire and knowing it would cut them, but also knowing the alternative was the bottom of the ocean. He stepped inside. Stitch was already moving, grabbed a wool blanket from the storage closet, wrapped it around the boy's shoulders without asking permission, the way a medic handles a casualty. Efficient, steady, no wasted motion. His hands checked the boy's temperature against his neck. Too cold. Way too cold. "How long you been out there?" Stitch asked. "I walked from town." "That's 6 miles." The boy said nothing. 6 miles barefoot in a November rainstorm. 6 miles because he had nowhere else to go and nobody else to ask, and the only address he could find was a motorcycle club full of men the rest of the world had already written off as criminals. Jax appeared with coffee. Black, steaming. He set it on the table in front of the boy and stepped back like he was afraid of scaring a stray dog. For a kid who solved most problems with his fists, the gesture was almost tender. Mac sat down across from the boy. The oak table between them was scarred with cigarette burns and knife marks, and the initials of men who were dead now. He folded his hands, waited. "What's your name?" "Eli. Eli Grayson." The last name hit the room like a concussion grenade. Roach's knife stopped moving. Stitch's jaw tightened. Jax looked at Mac with something raw and confused in his eyes, because he was too young to know the name but old enough to read the reaction it carved into every face around him. Grayson. Mac felt the name crawl through his chest like shrapnel working its way toward the surface after years buried in muscle and silence. Wade Grayson. Brother, rider, patch holder, who sat at this very table 8 years ago with a grin that could light up a room and a rage underneath it that could burn one down. Wade who laughed too loud and drank too fast and loved his Harley more than he loved anything human. Wade who started disappearing into bottles and pills in darkness until the man who came to meetings wasn't the same man who'd taken the oath. They voted him out. Unanimous. Mac delivered the words himself, standing in this room, watching Wade's face collapse inward like a building losing its foundation. "You're dead to us," Mac had said. And Wade walked into the night and never came back. Until now. Until his son stood shivering in the same doorway with the same desperate eyes and papers that carried his father's name like a scar. "Wade's your father," Mac said. Not a question. Eli flinched at the name. A full-body flinch, shoulders drawing inward, chin dropping toward his chest. The involuntary contraction of a boy whose nervous system had been rewired by violence to treat his own father's name as a threat. Yes, sir. Mac looked at the papers. Custody documents, family court filings. Soaked, ink bleeding at the edges, but legible enough to read the hearing date stamped in red. Thursday, 2 days from now. Who sent you here? Nobody. Eli's voice was barely a whisper. Nobody knows I'm here. My mom doesn't know. My dad doesn't know. I found this address in my dad's old stuff. He had a box in the closet he didn't know I knew about. Photos? A leather vest? This address written on the back of a Polaroid. The boy looked up. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying. He was past crying. He'd crossed into that territory beyond tears where the body simply runs out of ways to express what the mind can't process. The judge is going to give him custody. My mom can't afford a lawyer. The court-appointed one doesn't return her calls. My dad has money now. He has a lawyer in a suit. He told the judge my mom is unstable. Eli's hands tightened on the blanket. She's not unstable. She's tired. She works nights. She takes care of my baby sister. She hasn't slept in 3 months. He paused, swallowed hard. His next words came out like broken glass. He locks me in my room when he drinks. He said if I told anyone he'd hurt my mom and my sister. I told my teacher. She filed a report. Nothing happened. I told the school counselor. She said she'd look into it. Nobody looked into anything. Silence. The storm screamed outside. Inside, 4 men sat with the weight of a child's confession pressing against their ribs, like a hand squeezing a fist around their hearts. Max stared at Eli Grayson and saw everything he'd spent 8 years refusing to see. The trajectory. The inevitable mathematics of a violent man given access to the people he was supposed to protect. Wade hadn't just fallen apart. He'd detonated, and the shrapnel had landed in the bodies of a woman and 2 children that the iron vultures had never bothered to check on, because checking would have meant admitting they'd failed. They hadn't just voted Wade out. They'd abandoned his family. Stitch. Mac's voice was flat, controlled. The voice he used when emotion had to be packed into a box and locked shut so the mission could move forward. Get him dry clothes, warm food, whatever we've got. On it. Roach, pull everything we have on Wade, last known address, employment, arrest record, associates. I want it on this table by sunrise. Well, Roach nodded once, folded the knife, disappeared into the back office where a filing cabinet held the bones of the club's history. Jax, the young biker straightened. Yeah. Call Darla at the diner. Tell her we need the back room tomorrow morning. Breakfast for at least 6. Put it on my tab. We don't have a tab. Then start one. Jax pulled out his phone and walked toward the hallway, glancing back at Eli one more time before the shadows swallowed him. Something had shifted behind his eyes. The anger that usually sat coiled in his chest like a rattlesnake had gone quiet, replaced by something he didn't have a name for yet, something that burned differently. Eli watched the men move around him with the stunned expression of someone who had thrown a message in a bottle into a hurricane and somehow gotten an answer. You don't have to help me, he said quietly. Mac looked at him across the scarred table. Firelight from the wood stove caught the deep lines around his eyes and the gray threading through his beard, and for a moment he looked less like a biker president and more like a man carrying a debt he could never repay. Yeah, Mac said. We do. He didn't explain why. The boy didn't ask. Some debts don't need words. They just need boots on the ground and hands that show up when everyone else has walked away. By 2 a.m, Eli was asleep on the couch beneath 3 blankets with a belly full of canned soup and toast. His breathing had finally steadied, the shallow survival rhythm of sleep giving way to something deeper, something closer to safety. Stitch sat in the recliner across from him, reading his paperback under a lamp turned low. Guarding. Not because anyone told him to, because that's what a corpsman does. You don't leave the wounded alone in the dark. Max stood on the front porch with a cigarette he wasn't smoking, just holding, letting the cold cut into his knuckles while the rain tapered to a thin needling mist. The gravel lot stretched out before him, 12 Harleys lined up under the overhang like sleeping predators, chrome catching the blue glow of the distant road sign. Roach came outside, stood beside him without speaking for a long time. "Wade's been clean a year," Roach finally said. "Or he says he's clean. Got a job at the quarry outside Whitesburg, making decent money, renting a house on Cedar Creek, new truck, new lawyer, new story. Same man underneath. Maybe, maybe not. People change." Mac looked at him. "You believe that?" Roach's face was unreadable. 58 years of learning how to keep everything behind the mask. "I believe a boy walked 6 miles barefoot in a thunderstorm to ask strangers for help. That tells me everything I need to know about what's waiting for him at home." Mac took that in. Let it sit. The cigarette between his fingers had gone damp from the mist. "We failed him, Roach, 8 years ago. We kicked Wade out and never once checked what happened to his family. We were protecting the club. We were protecting ourselves." Mac flicked the unsmoked cigarette into the gravel. "Not the same thing." The mist drifted between them. Somewhere down the road, a diesel engine growled through the darkness and faded. "Thursday morning," Mac said. "Every patch holder rides. Full formation. We show up at that courthouse, and we stand behind that boy. That could bring attention we don't want." "I don't care." Roach studied him, nodded slowly. "All right. I'll make the calls." He went back inside. Mac stayed. The cold gnawed at his hands and his face and the places inside his chest where guilt had calcified into something permanent. He stood there until the mist turned to fog, and the fog turned to dawn, and the first gray light revealed the mountains hunched around the valley, like silent witnesses who had seen everything and said nothing. Morning came without mercy. Stitch had already made a supply run before the sun cleared the ridgeline. Boots, socks, a thermal jacket from the Goodwill on Route 7. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would make a 13-year-old feel like charity. Just functional, warm, the kind of gear a kid needed when the world had been stealing from him since birth. Eli woke up slowly, disoriented, eyes scanning the unfamiliar room with the quick practice sweep of someone who'd learned to assess threat before fully regaining consciousness. When his gaze found Stitch sitting in the recliner with 2 mugs of coffee, the boy's shoulders dropped half an inch. Not relaxation, just the absence of immediate danger. For Eli, that was as close to peace as it got. "Boots by the door," Stitch said. "Should fit. If they don't, we'll fix it." Eli looked at the boots, looked at Stitch. "Why? Why what? Why are you being nice to me?" Stitch set down his coffee, removed his reading glasses. His eyes, brown, gentle, cracked with the fine lines of a man who had stitched together bodies and souls in places the news never covered, met the boys without flinching. "Because somebody should have been nice to you a long time ago and nobody was. That's not your fault. And it's not something you need to earn." Eli didn't respond. He pulled on the boots. They fit. By 8 o'clock, Mac had gathered the available brothers at Darla's Diner, a cinder-block building with Formica counters and coffee that tasted like diesel fuel in Salvation. 6 riders. Full cuts. They filled the back booth like an occupying army, scarred hands wrapped around ceramic mugs, voices low, eyes hard. Mac laid out the custody documents, explained the situation in clinical terms stripped of sentiment. The boy, the father, the mother. The hearing in 36 hours. "We need to find Nora Grayson," Max said. "Eli says she's working nights at Mercy General. Home address is somewhere on the east side. He doesn't know the exact street. I know where she lives." The voice came from the end of the booth. Darla herself, 62, apron-wrapped, owner of the diner and unofficial intelligence network of Harlan County. She'd been refilling coffees and listening with the quiet efficiency of a woman who'd survived 3 husbands and trusted none of them. "Nora comes in here sometimes. Early mornings after her shift, she sits at the counter and orders 1 coffee and drinks it like it's the only warm thing she'll touch all day. Apartment complex on Birch Street, Unit 14, top floor. Place is falling apart." Mac looked at her. "You know about Wade?" Darla's expression hardened. "Everyone in this town knows about Wade, and everyone in this town looks the other way because Wade's new lawyer plays golf with the county judge, and the county judge plays poker with the sheriff. That's how it works around here. Always has. The words landed on the table like a dropped weapon. Mac absorbed them. Jax's hands curled into fists beneath the table. Stitch stared into his coffee like he was reading futures in the grounds. Roach sat motionless, knife still, watching Mac the way he always watched Mac, measuring, calculating, waiting for the order. Jax, Stitch, you're coming with me to Birch Street. Roach, I need you on the legal side. Find me someone who can represent Nora, pro bono or close to it. Somebody who isn't afraid of the local machine. That's a short list, Roach said. Then make it work. They finished their coffee, paid the tab, walked out into a morning so gray it felt like the sky itself had given up trying. The apartment complex on Birch Street looked like a building that had been condemned in spirit but kept alive by bureaucratic oversight. 3 stories, water-stained siding, a stairwell that smelled like mildew and old carpet, and something deeper, something chemical and sad that Mac recognized from 100 deployments. The smell of people living at the edge of what the human body can tolerate before it starts shutting down. Unit 14, top floor, a door with a broken peephole and a deadbolt that didn't fully catch. Mac knocked, waited. Knocked again. The door opened 2 inches on a chain. One eye, exhausted, frightened. The eye of a woman who had learned to treat every knock as a potential threat because the world had given her no reason to believe otherwise. Nora Grayson? Who are you? My name is Mac Mercer. I'm president of the Iron Vultures. Your son came to see us last night. The door didn't move. The eye didn't blink. Behind her, Mac could hear the faint sound of an infant fussing and the hum of a space heater working overtime against cold it couldn't defeat. Eli came to you? He walked 6 miles in the storm, barefoot. He asked us to come to court with him on Thursday. A pause. Long. Weighted with everything a mother carries when she realizes her child has done something both brave and terrifying, and she wasn't there to stop it or hold him afterward. The chain slid free. Nora Grayson stood in the doorway wearing scrubs from last night's shift, unwashed hair pulled back, dark circles beneath her eyes deep enough to cast shadows. 31 years old, but the exhaustion made her look 45. She was small, 5'3", thin in the way that hunger creates, not exercise, and her hands gripped the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Behind her, the apartment told the rest of the story. Empty cabinets with doors hanging open. A playpen with a sleeping infant wrapped in a blanket that had been washed so many times the fabric had gone transparent. A kitchen counter covered in past due notices arranged in neat stacks, as if organizing them might somehow reduce the weight. 1 lamp. 1 space heater. The remains of a life that had been stripped to its minimum viable components and was still losing ground. Nora looked at Mac, at the leather cut, at the patches, at the scars on his hands, and the ghost of Wade's world standing on her doorstep in the form of men who looked exactly like the kind of danger she'd spent years trying to escape. He shouldn't have gone to you, she whispered. Probably not, Mac said, but he did. And we're here. I don't want trouble. Neither do we. Then what do you want? Mac held her gaze. No softness, no false warmth, just the blunt, unpolished honesty of a man who had run out of gentle ways to say hard things 20 years ago. We want to make sure your son doesn't go back to a house where he gets locked in his room by a man who threatens to hurt you and your baby girl. We want to find you a lawyer who can actually show up to court and fight. And we want to stand behind Eli when he faces that judge, so that for once in his life, he's not standing alone. Nora's chin trembled. She bit down on it, hard. The way women do when they've learned that crying in front of strangers is a luxury they can't afford because the moment they break down, someone will use it as evidence of instability. Why? Her voice was barely audible. You threw Wade away 8 years ago. You didn't call. You didn't check. None of you came looking for me or for Eli. Why now? The question hung in the cold air between them like breath turning to frost. Mac didn't have a clean answer. Didn't have a noble one. The truth was ugly and simple, and it sat in his chest like a stone he'd been swallowing for years. Because your son walked 6 miles in a storm to ask for help, and the only door he knocked on was ours. That means every other door in this town was already closed. I can't undo 8 years of nothing, but I can stand in a courtroom on Thursday. Stitch stepped forward, slowly, non-threatening. He held up a paper grocery bag. We brought some things, food, diapers, formula, nothing fancy. Nora stared at the bag, then at Stitch, then at the infant sleeping behind her. Something cracked in her face, not breaking, not collapsing, but cracking the way ice cracks on a river in early spring. Not ready to thaw, but starting. She stepped aside. They entered the apartment one at a time, carefully. The way you enter a place that belongs to someone who has been hurt so many times that even kindness feels like a trap. Jax kept his hands visible at all times. Stitch moved with the deliberate calm of a man accustomed to clinical spaces and frightened patients. Max stayed near the door, letting Nora control the territory. Groceries went into the cabinets. Formula went next to the playpen. Stitch quietly assessed the space heater, noted the cracked window seal letting cold air pour in, and said nothing but made a mental note that would become a repair job by tomorrow. Nora sat on the edge of the couch and watched strangers fill her kitchen with food she hadn't been able to buy in 3 weeks. Her hands sat in her lap, clenched together, knuckles white. Wade has a lawyer named Desmond Tate, she said quietly. He's connected. Country club. Rotary. He plays golf with Judge Markham every other Saturday. My court-appointed attorney hasn't returned a call in 2 weeks. I left 9 voicemails. We're working on that, Max said. Wade is going to get custody. I know he is. He's got money now. He's got a house. He's got a story about how he got clean and turned his life around. The judge will believe him because the judge wants to believe him because it's easier than looking at what's really happening. Her voice didn't rise, didn't crack. It stayed flat and factual, the voice of a woman who had already done the math on her own destruction and accepted the result. The system doesn't work for people like me, Nora said. It never has. Mac looked at her, at the stack of past due notices, at the infant sleeping in a blanket too thin for November, at the empty kitchen of a woman working 12-hour night shifts to keep 2 children alive while the man who'd brutalized them hired a lawyer who cost more per hour than she earned in a week. Then we'll work outside the system, Mac said. Nora met his eyes. Something moved behind her exhaustion. Not hope, not yet, but the memory of what hope used to feel like before it was beaten out of her. He'll come after you, she said. He'll come after all of you. Wade doesn't lose. He destroys. Mac didn't answer. He didn't need to. He'd been destroyed before. By Fallujah. By the VA. By a government that trained him to kill and then handed him a pamphlet on reintegration and called it support. The Iron Vultures weren't built from men who were afraid of being destroyed. They were built from men who already had been. They left Nora's apartment an hour later. Stitch stayed behind to fix the window seal with duct tape and plastic sheeting. A temporary patch, but better than nothing. Jack sat on the stairwell outside, smoking a cigarette he didn't enjoy, jaw clenched, fists tight against his knees. I'm going to find Wade Grayson, Jack said when Mac passed him. I'm going to find him, and I'm going to No. Max stopped, turned, looked down at the younger man with eyes that carried 20 years of war and the hard-learned understanding that rage without discipline is just another form of self-destruction. You're going to do exactly what I tell you to do when I tell you to do it. No freelancing, no heroics, no violence. We do this clean, or we don't do it at all. Clean? That man locks his kid in a... I know what he does. Mac's voice dropped low. Dangerous. Not a threat. A boundary. And if we go after him with fists, we become exactly what the judge expects us to be. Criminals, thugs. We confirm every assumption this town already has about us, and Eli loses everything. You want to help that boy? Then you control the fire, Jax. You hold the line. Jax stared at him. The rage in his eyes warred with something newer, something less familiar. The slow, painful recognition that some fights require a different kind of strength than the one you know. He looked away, nodded once. Fine. Mac walked down the stairs. The fog had lifted enough to show the mountains, gray, ancient, indifferent. The town of Harlan stretched below them like a wound that never fully healed, just kept scabbing over and reopening with the seasons. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Unknown number. He answered, breathing on the other end, slow, deliberate. The kind of breathing that's performed, not involuntary, someone wanting him to listen. Then a voice, low, familiar, changed by years and chemicals and whatever darkness grows inside a man when he's cut loose from the only brotherhood he ever had. I know the boy came to you. Mac's hand tightened on the phone. His blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the November air. Wade. You should have left this alone, Mac. You should have let the court handle it. But you never could mind your own business, could you? Always had to be the hero, always had to play daddy to somebody else's mess. Mac said nothing. Listened. Let Wade fill the silence with whatever poison he needed to spit. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to get my son back, legally, properly, through a system that you and your little leather circus can't touch. And when I do, I'm going to make sure Eli knows exactly who tried to keep him from his father. Every one of you. A pause. The breathing changed, harder now, the mask slipping. And Mac, if I see a single cut inside that courthouse on Thursday, just one, I will burn your world to the ground. Not with fists, with lawyers, with judges, with every connection I've built while you were rotting in that clubhouse pretending you still matter. The line went dead. Mac stood in the parking lot of Birch Street Apartments holding a phone gone silent against his ear. The fog closed back in. The mountains disappeared. And somewhere across town, a man he'd once called brother was already loading the weapon he intended to use. Not a gun, not a blade, but something far more dangerous. The system itself. Thursday was 36 hours away. And Mac Mercer had just learned that Wade Grayson already knew they were coming. Mac didn't sleep that night. He sat in the clubhouse office, a windowless room at the back of the building that smelled like gun oil and old paper and the particular brand of stale air that accumulates in spaces where men make decisions they can't take back. A single desk lamp threw harsh yellow light across the surface in front of him, illuminating custody documents, printed court records, and 3 pages of notes in Roach's careful handwriting detailing everything they'd pulled together on Wade Grayson in the last 18 hours. The picture wasn't good. Wade had been busy, not just sober, strategic. The quarry job in Whitesburg paid union wages. The house on Cedar Creek had a lease signed 8 months ago. The lawyer, Desmond Tate, was the kind of small-town legal predator who charged $300 an hour and earned every penny by knowing exactly which judges to invite to dinner and which county officials to remind of favors owed. Wade's custody petition read like a redemption story written by a marketing agency. Recovery program completed, stable employment, community references from people whose names Mac recognized as the same network of business owners and local politicians who'd been running Harlan County like a private kingdom since before Mac was born. On paper, Wade Grayson was a changed man. On paper, Nora Grayson was a barely functional single mother living in a condemned apartment complex with no savings, no legal representation, and a work schedule that kept her away from her children 12 hours a night. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly the way it was designed to work. For men like Wade. Against women like Nora. And the only people standing between that machine and a 13-year-old boy were 4 bikers with criminal records and a reputation that would make any family court judge reach for the gavel before they finished introducing themselves. Mac rubbed his eyes. The clock on the wall read 4:17. Thursday morning was 26 hours away. His phone sat on the desk. Wade's call still burned in his memory like a brand pressed into skin. I will burn your world to the ground, not an empty threat. Wade had always been surgical when he was sober. It was the drinking that made him sloppy. Clean Wade was something far more dangerous, patient, calculating, capable of playing a long game while the world believed in his transformation. The office door opened. Stitch stood in the frame holding 2 mugs of coffee, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, eyes rimmed with the kind of fatigue that doesn't come from one bad night, but from years of accumulated sleeplessness that the body eventually stops fighting. You should rest. Can't. Stitch set a mug on the desk, sat in the chair across from Mac without being invited. The leather creaked beneath him. He wrapped both hands around his coffee and stared at the steam rising from it, like he was reading weather patterns. The boy had nightmares, Stitch said. Woke up twice. First time he was calling for his mother. Second time, he was just screaming. No words, just sound. Mac's jaw tightened. He said nothing. I sat with him until he fell back asleep. Didn't touch him. Didn't talk. Just sat there. That seemed to be enough. Stitch paused. He reminds me of someone. Don't. He reminds me of Wade. Before. The words landed between them like a dropped grenade, with the pin still in. Mac looked at Stitch with eyes that held a warning. Not anger, but the kind of boundary a man sets when someone is walking toward a door he's spent years keeping locked. Wade at 13 was a kid getting kicked around a trailer park in Letcher County, Stitch continued, ignoring the warning the way only a man who'd served in the same unit could. No father. Mother who rotated boyfriends like shifts at a factory. He showed up at the clubhouse the same way Eli did. Different storm, same desperation. You remember that? I remember. You took him in. You gave him the patch. You said he was family. And then he beat his wife in front of his infant son, and we cut him loose. I remember that too. Stitch nodded slowly. So what happens when this one grows up the same way? What happens if we step in now and Eli turns into his father in 15 years? Do we cut him loose too? Max stared at the medic. The question wasn't rhetorical. It was the kind of question that only a man carrying his own catalog of failures would ask. The ex-corpsman who'd lost his license because the pills that were supposed to help him stop shaking after his third deployment became the only thing that kept him alive until they nearly killed him. I don't know, Max said, but I know what happens if we don't step in. The boy already showed us. He walked 6 miles in a thunderstorm because every other option was already gone. Stitch drank his coffee, set it down. Then we should talk about what happened at the diner. Mac's eyes narrowed. What about it? Jax cornered Darla before we left, asked her where Wade's house was. Exact address. She gave it to him. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes detonation. Pressurized, airless, vibrating at a frequency that only men attuned to violence could detect. Max stood up. The chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a blade against stone. He crossed the hallway in 4 strides, threw open the door to the bunk room, and found Jax's cot empty. Blankets thrown back, boots gone. The window beside the cot cracked open an inch, cold air threading through the gap like a whisper. He checked the lot. Jax's Harley, a flat black dyno with straight pipes and no mirrors, was gone. When? Mac turned to Stitch, who had followed him to the door. Sometime after midnight, I heard an engine, but I was with Eli. I thought he was just riding to clear his head. He's going to Wade's house. Probably. Mac was already moving, keys off the hook, cut thrown on over a thermal that still smelled like Nora's apartment. Mildew, formula, the sharp chemical trace of a space heater burning dust. He hit the gravel lot at a half jog, boots crunching ice, breath coming in short white bursts that dissolved into the pre-dawn darkness. Roach materialized from the shadows beside the front gate. He'd been sitting in a camp chair with a thermos of coffee and a shotgun across his knees, watching the road the way he'd watched perimeters in jungles 40 years ago. Jax left at 12:40, Roach said calmly. Max stopped. You saw him leave and didn't stop him? He's a grown man. He makes his own choices. He's about to commit assault on the father of the child we're trying to protect in a custody hearing that's 26 hours away. If he touches Wade, we lose everything. Roach's expression didn't change. It never changed. That was the thing about Roach. His face had calcified into a mask somewhere in the Mekong Delta in 1969, and it had never thawed. But his eyes moved, tracking Mac with the deliberate precision of a man calculating angles. Maybe that's the point. Mac felt something cold crawl up his spine, not from the weather, from the implication. What are you saying? Roach stood, slowly. The shotgun stayed cradled in his arms like an infant. I'm saying maybe this isn't as simple as you want it to be. Maybe not everyone in this club agrees that riding into a courtroom for Wade Grayson's kid is the right move. This isn't about Wade. This is about Eli. It's about Wade. It's always about Wade. Roach stepped closer. His voice dropped to the register he used when he was saying things that mattered. Low, measured, each word placed like a stone in a wall. You carried guilt about voting him out for 8 years. You barely talked about it, but every brother in this club knew it was eating you alive. And now his son walks in, and suddenly you're running a rescue mission with a skeleton crew and no exit strategy. You want to know what Jax is thinking? He's thinking the same thing I'm thinking, that this isn't about saving a boy. This is about you trying to save yourself. The words hit Mac like rounds to a vest, stopped by armor, but felt in the bones underneath. He stood in the freezing gravel lot and stared at the man who'd been riding beside him for 15 years and felt the ground shift beneath his boots. Not because Roach was wrong, because Roach might be right, and the distance between those two things was a canyon he couldn't see the bottom of. I'm going after Jax, Mac said, before he does something that can't be undone. Roach nodded, didn't offer to come, didn't wish him luck. Just stood there in the dark with his shotgun and his thermos and his silence and watched Mac throw a leg over his Harley and fire the engine into the frozen night. The road to Cedar Creek was 12 miles of switchbacks through mountain hollows where the fog sat so thick it erased the headlight 3 feet ahead of the front wheel. Mac rode with his jaw locked and his hands aching on the grips, the engine vibrating through his arms and his chest and the metal pins in his left knee from a Humvee rollover in 2004. Cold seeped through his leather and his thermals and found the places where his body had never fully healed. The shoulder that dislocated twice, the ribs that cracked in a bar fight in Memphis, the knuckles that creaked like old floorboards whenever the temperature dropped below 40. He found Jax's Harley parked on the shoulder half a mile from Wade's address. Engine still warm, keys in the ignition. The bike leaned against a guardrail like an abandoned weapon. Mac killed his engine, listened. The hollow was silent except for the drip of condensation from pine branches and the distant sound of a creek running fast with November rain. Wade's house sat at the end of a gravel drive, a single-story rental with a porch light on and a black Ford pickup parked in front. Modest, clean, the kind of place a man sets up when he wants to prove something to a judge. Mac walked the drive on foot. Slow, quiet. His boots found the soft edge of the gravel where the sound was minimal. Halfway down, he saw Jax. The younger biker stood at the edge of the tree line, 30 yards from Wade's front porch, hands at his sides, staring at the house with an expression Mac had seen before, on Marines standing at the threshold of buildings they were about to enter in Fallujah, knowing what was inside, knowing what it would cost, measuring the distance between who they were and who they were about to become. Jax! The kid didn't turn. He's in there. Lights went off 20 minutes ago. Walk away. He locks that boy in a room, Mac. He threatens a woman and a baby, and the system's going to hand him a trophy for it. Walk away. Jax turned then. His eyes were wet, but his jaw was granite. The anger was still there. It was always there, coiled in his chest like barbed wire, but underneath it, Mac saw something he hadn't expected. Pain. Raw, personal, volcanic. My old man used to lock me in the bathroom, Jack said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. The way people talk when they're telling you something they've never told anyone. When I was 7, 8, 9, he'd drink and I'd hear the belt come off and I'd run and he'd lock the door from the outside and leave me in there all night. No light, no food, just the sound of him passing out on the couch and my mom crying in the bedroom. Max stood still. The fog drifted between them. Somewhere in the house a light flickered. A TV screen behind curtained windows, cold blue light pulsing against the glass. I told my teacher, Jax continued. She filed a report. CPS came out once, talked to my dad. My dad smiled and shook their hands, and they left. And that night was the worst one. Because he knew I'd talked. And he wanted to make sure I knew what happened when you talk. His hands were shaking, not from cold. I did 18 months in county for beating a man in a bar who put his hands on a waitress. 18 months. You know what my father got for 7 years of beating his kid? Nothing. Not a single night, because the system doesn't punish men like him. It protects them. Mac felt the words settle into his chest like stones dropped into water. Every ripple touched a memory he'd packed away. Wade's grin turning to grimace. The vote at the table. The door closing. The silence that followed for 8 years. I understand, Mac said. And he meant it. Not as a platitude. as a statement of fact from one broken man to another. Then let me go in there. No. Why? Because if you go through that door, you become your father. The words landed like a slap. Jax recoiled, physically, visibly, his whole body jerking backward like he'd touched a live wire. His face contorted. For a moment, Mac thought he was going to swing. The fist clenched. The weight shifted. Every muscle in the younger man's body loaded for the explosion. Then it drained out of him. Not slowly, all at once. Like a wave crashing and pulling back and leaving nothing on the shore but wet sand and debris. Jack sat down on the frozen ground, put his head in his hands. His shoulders shook once, twice, then stopped. Mac sat down beside him. Two bikers in leather cuts sitting on the edge of a gravel road at 4 a.m. in the mountains of Tennessee. Watching fog erase a house where a violent man slept peacefully while his son trembled on a clubhouse couch 20 miles away. They sat there until the cold became unbearable. Then they stood and walked back to their bikes and rode home through the fog without speaking. Wednesday burned through fast. By noon, the clubhouse had become something it hadn't been in years. Operational, purposeful. A machine with moving parts aligned toward a single objective. Roach had made calls through the morning to every contact the club maintained across eastern Kentucky. Bail bondsmen, mechanics, bartenders, a retired public defender in Knoxville who owed the Vultures a favor from 2019. And by 1 o'clock he'd found a lawyer. Her name was Claire Aldridge, 44. Former county prosecutor who'd left the DA's office after a case involving a local politician's son was buried before it reached the grand jury. She'd gone into private practice, handled family law, charged reasonable rates, and had a reputation for being the only attorney in 4 counties who refused to play the golf course and handshake game that ran the local judiciary. She arrived at the clubhouse at 2 o'clock in a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and a briefcase held together with duct tape. Short hair, no makeup, eyes that assessed the clubhouse, the bikes, and the 4 bikers in leather cuts with the clinical detachment of a woman who'd spent 15 years in courtrooms and had lost the capacity for surprise. "You've got 22 hours, she said, sitting down at the oak table without waiting for an invitation. "And approximately 0 legal standing. You understand that?" Max sat across from her. "We're not asking for legal standing. We're asking you to represent Nora." "I spoke with her this morning. She's terrified. She's exhausted. And she has a case, but it's buried under 6 months of procedural neglect by a court-appointed attorney who I suspect was deliberately running out the clock." "Deliberately?" Claire opened her briefcase, pulled out a folder. "Nora's court-appointed attorney is a man named Gerald Finch. Finch shares office space with Desmond Tate, Wade's lawyer. Same building, same floor, same coffee pot." She let that sit. "I can't prove collusion, but I can tell you that 9 unreturned voicemails isn't incompetence, it's strategy. If Nora never gets to mount a defense, Wade wins by default." Jack slammed his fist on the table. Coffee cups jumped. "So the whole thing is rigged?" "The whole thing is Harlan County," Claire said without flinching. "This is how it works. The people with connections get representation. The people without connections get processed. I've seen it 100 times. "So what do we do?" Stitch asked. Claire looked at each of them in turn. Her gaze lingered on Mac's president patch, on the tattoos, on the scars, on everything a judge would see tomorrow morning and immediately categorize as evidence against Nora's fitness as a parent. "You stay quiet," she said. "You sit in that courtroom and you don't speak, you don't react, you don't make eye contact with Wade, and you don't give Judge Markham a single reason to question who Nora associates with. You're there as community support, nothing more, nothing less. And if the judge asks who we are, then I handle it. Not you, not any of you. You are furniture tomorrow, understood?" Roach almost smiled. It was the closest thing to approval Mac had ever seen on his face. The old biker respected anyone who could walk into a room full of dangerous men and tell them to sit down and shut up without blinking. "What about Eli?" Mac asked. Claire's expression shifted. The professional mask cracked enough to reveal something underneath. Not softness exactly, but the particular kind of controlled grief that builds in people who work inside systems that hurt children. "Eli can testify if he wants to. No one can force him. But if he takes that stand, it changes everything. A 13-year-old boy describing abuse in his own words in front of a judge with a courtroom watching, that's the most powerful evidence we have. And it's also the most dangerous thing we can ask of him. Dangerous how? Because Wade's lawyer will cross-examine. Tate is good. He'll ask questions designed to make Eli contradict himself, minimize the abuse, or implicate Nora as the real source of instability. A 13-year-old under that kind of pressure can crack. And if he cracks, it looks like coaching. The room absorbed that, the weight of it. The mathematics of sending a traumatized child into a legal arena, built by adults, and run by adults, and stacked against everything Eli represented. Mac looked across the room to where Eli sat on the clubhouse couch, cross-legged, helping Stitch sort through a box of old engine parts. The boy had been quiet all day, not withdrawn, not fearful, but watchful, taking in the movements around him with the cataloging precision of someone who'd learned to track every adult in every room as a survival mechanism. His hands moved steadily through the parts, separating bolts from washers, placing each piece in neat rows with the careful attention of a kid who discovered that mechanical things made sense in ways that people didn't. He looked up, caught Mac watching him, held the gaze without flinching. That was new. Yesterday, eye contact lasted a fraction of a second before the boy's survival instincts pulled his gaze to the floor. Now he was holding it, testing it, measuring whether the man across the room was safe enough to look at directly. Mac gave him a small nod. Nothing dramatic, just acknowledgement. One human being telling another, "I see you." Eli nodded back, then returned to his engine parts. Claire stayed for 2 hours. She built a case timeline on a legal pad, reviewed Nora's documentation, and called in 3 favors to get an emergency motion filed before close of business. By the time she left, the late afternoon light had turned the clubhouse windows amber, and the temperature outside had dropped below freezing. Mac walked her to her car. The gravel crunched beneath their shoes, her breath clouded in the cold. "One more thing," Claire said, hand on the car door. "I pulled Wade's records. He completed a 12-month recovery program. Employer references are strong. Community standing is manufactured but solid. On paper, he's the model reformed father." She paused, chose her next words carefully. "But I also found something that wasn't in the official record, a police report from 9 months ago. Domestic disturbance call to his Cedar Creek address. Officers responded. No arrest. Report was filed but never forwarded to the family court." Mac felt his pulse change. What was in the report? A woman, not Nora, someone else, called 911 at 2 in the morning. Screaming heard from inside the house. Officers arrived. Wade answered the door calm and cooperative. The woman was gone by the time they entered. No complainant, no arrest sussed, no follow-up. Who was the woman? I don't know. The report lists a name, but it's redacted in the copy I obtained. I'm working on it. She got in her car, started the engine, looked up at Mac through the cracked windshield. "Mr. Mercer, I should tell you something. I took this case because it's the right thing to do, not because I think we'll win. Judge Markham has ruled in favor of fathers in disputed custody cases 8 out of the last 10 times. He believes in paternal rights. He believes in second chances. And he believes that men who wear leather vests and ride motorcycles are not the kind of community support that reflects well on a mother's judgment." Understood. You're walking into a courtroom where the judge, the opposing counsel, and the system itself are all tilted against you. The only advantage we have is Eli's testimony and that police report, if I can get the full version in time. She backed down the gravel drive and disappeared into the early dark. Max stood alone in the lot. The Harleys sat in their row, chrome dulled by cold, engines silent. Inside the clubhouse, he could hear Stitch talking to Eli about valve timing, Jax's voice somewhere in the background. Lower than usual, the aggression dampened but not gone. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. A photograph. Mac opened it. The screen light cut harsh against his face in the gathering dark. The photo showed the clubhouse, shot from the tree line across the road. Taken today, he could see Stitch's truck in the lot with the grocery bag still visible in the bed. The timestamp read 11:47 a.m. While they'd been inside planning, someone had been outside watching. A second text followed. No photograph this time, just words. You're not the only ones who protect their own. Mac looked up from the phone, scanned the tree line. Darkness and fog, and the skeletal branches of winter oaks reaching toward a sky that had no stars. Nothing moved, nothing visible. But someone was there, had been there. Watching, counting bikes, noting faces, cataloging the defensive position of a clubhouse full of men who didn't know they were being surveilled until 5 seconds ago. He went inside, closed the door, threw the deadbolt, walked past Eli and Stitch without stopping, found Roach in the back office cleaning a firearm that was already clean. "We've got a problem." Roach looked at the phone, at the photograph, at the text. His expression didn't change, but his hand stopped moving over the weapon. "Wade didn't take this," Roach said. "How do you know?" "Wrong angle. This was taken from the East Ridge. That's a 400-yard shot through tree cover. Wade doesn't have the patience for that kind of positioning. Someone else took this. Someone trained." The implication settled over the room like a fog that wouldn't lift. "Wade has people," Max said. "Wade has connections," Roach corrected. "That's worse." Mac leaned against the desk, felt the weight of 22 hours pressing against his ribs like a hand squeezing his lungs shut. The case, the boy, the courtroom, Wade's lawyer, the judge, the rigged system, and now surveillance from an unknown position by unknown hands working for a man they'd once called brother. "Do we tell Nora?" "No, not tonight. She's got enough to carry." "The brothers?" "Jax will want to go hunting. Tell him, and he's back in those woods with a weapon." "Then what?" Roach set down the firearm, picked up his coffee, drank it cold. "We do what we always do. We ride in the morning, we stand behind the boy, and we deal with whatever's coming after it arrives." Mac nodded. But something had shifted in his chest, a pressure he hadn't felt since Fallujah, the particular weight of knowing you're walking into an ambush and going anyway because the mission doesn't change just because the odds do. He spent the rest of the evening in the common room, didn't say much, watched Eli and Stitch work through the engine parts until the boys' eyes started closing on their own, watched Jax pace the hallway like a caged animal, burning through cigarettes, checking his phone, running his thumb along the scar on his right hand that he never explained to anyone. Watched Roach sit in the corner with a map of the courthouse spread on his knees, marking exits and sight lines with a red pen like he was planning a tactical extraction. At 10 o'clock, Mac found Eli alone on the couch, blanket pulled to his chin, staring at the ceiling. "You don't have to testify tomorrow," Mac said. He sat in the chair beside the couch. His voice was quiet, stripped of command, just a man talking to a boy in a dark room. "Nobody's going to force you. Whatever you decide is your decision." Eli was quiet for a long time. The wood stove ticked as the fire settled. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. "If I don't talk," Eli said, "he gets me back." "Maybe. The lawyer is working on other angles." "But if I talk, the judge hears what happened." "Yes. And his lawyer will try to make me look like a liar." "Probably." Eli turned his head on the pillow, looked at Mac with those ancient, damaged eyes that belonged to a child and simultaneously to something much older, something forged in the furnace of a childhood spent navigating a violent man's moods the way sailors navigate storms, by reading pressure and silence and the particular quality of footsteps in a hallway. "I'm not a liar," Eli said. "I know you're not." "Then I'll talk." Mac looked at the boy, at the bruise on his wrist yellowing now at the edges as the body slowly erased the evidence that the system had failed to collect, at the new boots on the floor beside the couch, at the small hands resting on top of the blanket, still and steady for the first time since he'd walked through the door 2 nights ago. "All right," Mac said. "Then we'll be right behind you." Eli closed his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing changed, deepened, settled into the rhythm of genuine sleep, not the shallow survival sleep of the first night, but something fuller, something that only happens when a body decides, even temporarily, that the space around it is safe enough to let go. Max sat with him for another hour, then stood, walked to the front porch, lit a cigarette he would actually smoke this time, drew the heat into his lungs and let it burn. The mountains were invisible in the darkness. The road was empty. The clubhouse at his back hummed with the breathing of damaged men who had chosen, against every instinct for self-preservation, to stand between a child and the machinery grinding toward him. His phone buzzed one final time. Claire Aldridge. He answered. "I got the full police report," she said. Her voice had changed. The professional calm was gone. Something tighter underneath. Something shaken. "The woman who called 911 from Wade's house 9 months ago. I found her name." Mac waited. It was Nora's younger sister, Sarah. She'd gone to Wade's house to try to negotiate visitation terms directly. Nobody knows what happened inside. But Sarah hasn't been seen since. The cigarette burned down to Mac's fingers. He didn't feel it. "What do you mean, hasn't been seen?" "I mean, she's gone, Mac. No forwarding address, no employment record, no phone activity. Her family filed a missing persons report 4 months ago. It went nowhere. The detective assigned to the case is the same officer who responded to the domestic disturbance call and filed the report that was never forwarded to family court. The night pressed in. The cold pressed in. The truth pressed in from every direction like water filling a room with no exits. "Does Nora know?" Mac's voice was barely a whisper. "Nora thinks her sister moved to Virginia and stopped returning calls. That's what Wade told her. That's what everyone told her." Mac stood on the porch of the Iron Vulture's clubhouse at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, with a dead cigarette burning his fingers, and the full weight of what they were walking into settling over him like a shroud. This wasn't a custody hearing anymore. This was something much darker. And in 12 hours, they were going to walk into a courtroom and sit across from a man who might have made a woman disappear, while that man smiled at a judge and asked for his son back. Mac didn't tell anyone about Sarah. Not yet. Not until he understood exactly what they were carrying into that courtroom. He stood on the porch until the cigarette burned down to nothing and his fingers went numb and the cold had eaten through every layer between his skin and the night. Then he went inside, locked the door, and sat in the office with the phone pressed against the desk like it might detonate if he touched it again. Claire's words circled his skull on a loop that wouldn't break. "She hasn't been seen since. No forwarding address. No phone activity. 9 months. A woman walks into Wade Grayson's house on Cedar Creek, and 9 months later the only trace of her existence is a missing persons report sitting in a filing cabinet belonging to the same detective who buried the domestic disturbance call. The same detective. The same system. The same invisible architecture of silence that had been protecting Wade since he learned how to smile at the right people. Mac opened the filing cabinet behind the desk, pulled Wade's old records, membership documents, intake forms, the paperwork from his patching in ceremony 12 years ago. He flipped through pages he hadn't looked at in nearly a decade until he found what he was looking for: emergency contacts. Wade had listed 2. The first was Nora, then his girlfriend. The second was a name Mac didn't recognize, Carl Jessup, listed as Uncle with a phone number and a Harlan County address. He wrote the name down, filed it, set it aside for Roach, who would know how to pull the thread without unraveling the wrong things. At 5 o'clock, Mac made coffee. By 5:30, the smell had woken Stitch, who appeared in the kitchen doorway with his reading glasses crooked and his boots untied, moving on autopilot toward the pot the way a compass needle moves toward north. "Today," Stitch said. "Today." They drank in silence. The wood stove had burned low during the night, and the clubhouse held a deep chill that settled into the floorboards and the furniture and the bones of every man inside it. Through the kitchen window, the sky was starting to lighten. Not sunrise, just the gradual retreat of total darkness into something gray and heavy and non-committal, like the world couldn't decide whether it wanted to face the day either. Roach arrived at 6. He'd gone home at some point during the night, his own place, a cabin 4 miles north, and returned wearing a clean flannel under his cut, beard-trimmed, boots polished. The effort was noticeable. Roach hadn't polished his boots for anything in 3 years. The gesture was his version of suiting up for war. Mac pulled him into the office, closed the door, told him everything Claire had said, watched Roach's face as the information landed. The police report, the domestic disturbance, Sarah's disappearance, the detective who'd handled both cases. Roach listened without interrupting. When Mac finished, the old biker was quiet for a full minute. His fingers rested on the desk, perfectly still, the way they always went still when his mind was running calculations that his body refused to telegraph. "Carl Jessup," Max said, sliding the paper across the desk. Roach looked at it. His eyes changed, not widened, narrowed, a micro-expression so brief that anyone who didn't know him would have missed it entirely. But Mac had been reading Roach's face for 15 years, and he caught it like a sniper catches a muzzle flash. "You know the name," Mac said. "I know the name." Roach set the paper down, placed one finger on it. Carl Jessup was county sheriff from 2002 to 2014, retired early after an internal affairs investigation that went nowhere because 3 of the 4 investigators had campaign contributions from the same PAC that funded Jessup's re-election. He's Wade's mother's brother. Blood uncle. Mac felt the pieces locking into place with the sick, mechanical precision of a trap being assembled around them in real time. Wade's uncle was a former sheriff. Wade's lawyer played golf with the sitting judge. Wade's domestic disturbance report was buried by a detective who answered to a department that Jessup had run for 12 years. The court-appointed attorney who'd been assigned to protect Nora shared office space with Wade's legal team. It wasn't a custody case. It was a machine, built over years, lubricated with favors and silence and the quiet exchange of power between men who understood that protecting each other was the same as protecting themselves. "Does Jessup still have pull?" Mac asked. "In this county, a former sheriff doesn't lose pull. He loses the title. The pull stays. The relationships stay. The debts stay. Every officer who got promoted under Jessup's watch owes him. Every prosecutor who got convictions using his department's evidence knows the game. Carl Jessup is the foundation, Mac. Wade is just the house built on top of it." Mac stared at the wall, at the photographs of dead brothers, at the framed charter that established the Iron Vultures as a motorcycle club, not a gang, not a criminal enterprise, but a brotherhood of men who'd been broken by the institutions that claimed to serve them and had rebuilt themselves from scraps. "We're riding into an ambush," Max said. "We've been in ambushes before. Not like this. In Fallujah, I could see the enemy. In that courtroom, the enemy is the room itself." Roach stood, crossed to the door, paused with his hand on the knob. "Then we make sure we're not fighting the room. We're fighting for the boy. Everything else is noise." He left. Mac stayed. The coffee went cold in his hands. At 7:15, Mac woke Eli. The boy came up from sleep the way he always did, fast, alert, eyes open and scanning before his brain fully engaged. Survival software running on hardware that should have been playing video games and worrying about homework. 13 years old and wired like a combat veteran. "Morning," Mac said. He sat in the chair, kept his voice level. "Courthouse opens at 9. Claire will meet us there at 8:30. You still want to testify?" Eli sat up, pushed the blanket aside. His new boots were already beside the couch, laces tucked inside, arranged with the precise attention of a boy who'd learned to keep his belongings ready for rapid departure because you never knew when you'd need to leave fast. "Yes. It's going to be hard. Tate will try to confuse you. He'll twist your words. He'll make you feel like you're the one on trial." "I know." "How do you know?" Eli looked at him, those old, ancient eyes in a young face. "Because that's what my dad does. Every time. He makes you think everything is your fault until you can't remember who started it." Mac nodded, nothing else to say to a boy who understood manipulation better at 13 than most adults did at 50. Stitch appeared with a clean shirt, a comb, and a toothbrush still in the packaging. He handed them to Eli without ceremony. The boy took them without comment. 2 people exchanging necessities in a language that didn't require words. The medic providing, the patient accepting, the transaction stripped of everything except function. 8 o'clock. The lot. 12 Harleys. Mac had called every available patch holder within a 60-mile radius, and they'd come. Men who hadn't been to the clubhouse in months. Ox, a 300-pound former ironworker who'd lost 2 fingers to a press and replaced them with a philosophy that said the only things worth gripping were handlebars and the necks of people who hurt children. Deacon, not a title but a name, 46, quiet, ran a welding shop in Everts and hadn't spoken more than 20 sentences in any given month since his daughter overdosed 4 years ago. Pike, Cutter, Hound, Brim, names that sounded like weapons because the men who carried them had been weaponized by a world that used them and discarded them and never once asked if they were okay. They lined up in the gravel lot without being told the formation. 2 abreast. Mac and Roach at the front, Stitch and Jax flanking Eli, who would ride behind Stitch on the medic's Softail, the rest filling in behind like a wall of chrome and leather and controlled fury. Nobody spoke. Engines fired one at a time, a rolling thunder that built from the front and cascaded backward until 12 Harleys vibrated in unison, the sound reverberating off the clubhouse walls and echoing into the hollow like a warning sent to no one in particular and everyone at the same time. Mac looked back once, caught Eli's face behind Stitch's shoulder. The boy's jaw was set. His hands gripped Stitch's leather cut with white-knuckle intensity. Fear was there. Mac could see it in the tightness around his eyes. But it wasn't winning. Not yet. They rolled out. The ride to the Harlan County Courthouse was 9 miles through mountain roads still wet from overnight fog. Mac led at a pace that was deliberate. Not fast, not slow, but measured. The speed of men who wanted to be seen, who wanted the sound of their engines to precede them like a declaration. They passed through the center of town, past the diner, past the gas station, past the elementary school where Eli had told his teacher what was happening and watched the report disappear into the same silence that swallowed everything in this county that powerful men wanted buried. People on sidewalks stopped and stared. A woman in a bakery window pressed her hand against the glass. An old man on a bench tipped his hat, not at the bikes, but at what they represented. Something the town hadn't seen in a long time. Men riding towards something instead of away from it. The courthouse sat at the top of Main Street, a limestone building with columns that were supposed to represent justice and mostly represented the ambitions of whatever politician had commissioned them in 1947. Steps worn smooth by decades of feet. American flag hanging limp in the windless cold. 12 Harleys parked in formation at the curb. Engines cut. Silence flooded back in like water filling a vacuum. Boots hit pavement in sequence, a percussion of leather and concrete that drew every eye in the parking lot. Claire Aldridge was waiting at the bottom of the steps. She watched the bikers dismount with an expression that fell somewhere between professional concern and reluctant admiration. "Subtle," she said. "Wasn't trying to be," Mac replied. "I can see that." Nora arrived separately. She came in a borrowed car driven by a neighbor, a middle-aged woman who looked terrified of the bikers and refused to make eye contact with anyone in leather. Nora stepped out wearing the best clothes she owned, which amounted to a dark blouse with a small tear at the cuff that she'd tried to mend with thread that didn't quite match. Her infant daughter was with the neighbor, who would wait in the car. Her hands shook as she gathered her folder of documents. She saw Eli standing between Stitch and Jax. Her face collapsed for a fraction of a second. The involuntary breakdown of a mother seeing her son in the care of strangers and feeling simultaneously grateful and devastated. Before she rebuilt the mask with the practiced speed of a woman who'd been reconstructing her composure multiple times daily, for years. "Hey, Mom." "Hey, baby." She hugged him, brief, tight. The kind of embrace that tries to communicate an entire history of love and apology and fear in 3 seconds because that's all the time the situation allows. Claire pulled Nora aside for a final briefing. Mac positioned the brothers around the courthouse entrance, not blocking anything, not intimidating anyone, just present, visible. 12 men in leather cuts standing in the cold November air like monuments to a question the town had been avoiding. Where were you when this family needed help? At 8:55, a black Mercedes pulled into the lot. Desmond Tate emerged first. Late 50s. Silver hair. Charcoal suit that cost more than Nora's monthly rent. He carried a leather briefcase that gleamed under the overcast sky and walked with the confident, unhurried stride of a man who already knew the outcome because he'd helped write it. Wade came second. Mac hadn't seen him in 8 years. The change was physical and absolute. The wild-eyed, gaunt addict who'd stumbled out of the clubhouse after being voted out had been replaced by a man who looked like he'd been assembled from a catalog of reformed respectability. Clean-shaven. Short hair. Button-down shirt under a sport coat. New boots. He moved with controlled precision, each step calibrated to project stability and remorse and the particular brand of humility that plays well in courtrooms. But his eyes were the same. Mac saw it instantly. The same restless hunger that had always lived behind Wade's smile. The same flickering assessment, scanning the environment for threats, for opportunities, for the leverage points in every interaction. The eyes of a predator who'd learned to wear a different skin. Wade's gaze swept the bikers, counted them. 12. His jaw tightened for a half second before the mask reasserted itself. He found Mac at the center of the formation and held the look for 3 full beats. No words, no gestures. Just 2 men who'd once bled together, measuring the distance between who they used to be and what they'd become. Wade smiled. Small. Controlled. The smile of a man who has a script and is sticking to it. He walked inside without speaking. Tate paused on the steps, looked at the row of Harleys, looked at Mac. His expression carried the polished disdain of a man who considers himself several tax brackets above the company he's keeping. "Interesting strategy," Tate said. "Bringing a motorcycle gang to a family court hearing." "We're a club," Mac said, "not a gang." "I'm sure Judge Markham will appreciate the distinction." Tate followed his client inside. The courthouse doors closed behind them with a sound that echoed down the stone steps like a gavel falling early. Claire touched Mac's arm. "Stay controlled in there, whatever happens." They filed in. 12 bikers in a courthouse built for decisions that rarely favored the people who needed them most. The hallway smelled like floor wax and old radiator heat, and the accumulated anxiety of 1,000 families who'd walked these tiles praying for outcomes. The architecture itself seemed designed to deny. Courtroom B, 2nd floor. A wood-paneled room with fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency guaranteed to compound every headache and amplify every nerve. 2 tables, 1 bench, an American flag in the corner and the seal of Harlan County on the wall. The kind of civic decoration that promises fairness the way a casino promises odds. Nora and Claire took the left table. Wade and Tate took the right. The bikers filled the gallery benches behind Nora. 12 men in leather occupying space that was usually reserved for social workers and grandparents, and the occasional journalist who covered family court with the enthusiasm of someone assigned to obituaries. Judge Gerald Markham entered at 9:15. Mid-60s. Thin. Wire-rimmed glasses perched on a nose that looked like it had been pinched by disapproval for so long it had permanently narrowed. His eyes swept the courtroom and landed on the gallery with a look that could have frozen the radiators. "Counselor," he said, addressing Claire without using her name, "would you explain the presence of these individuals?" "Community supporters, Your Honor. They're here in a non-participatory capacity to demonstrate the network of support available to my client and her children." "They're a motorcycle gang," Tate interjected from the other table. "Club," Jack said from the gallery. Mac shot him a look that could have peeled paint. Jax closed his mouth. His jaw worked silently, grinding words into powder behind his teeth. Judge Markham studied the bikers for a long moment. His expression was unreadable in the way that judges' expressions are professionally unreadable, designed to project neutrality while concealing the calculations already underway. "They may remain, provided they observe standard courtroom decorum. Any disruption, and I will clear the gallery. Proceed." Claire opened. Precise, clinical, devastating in her efficiency. She outlined Nora's employment history, her housing situation, her childcare arrangements, and the consistent pattern of violence that had characterized Wade Grayson's behavior during the marriage. She referenced the DHS reports. 3 separate filings, each one investigated and each one closed without action. She noted the 9 unreturned voicemails to Nora's previous court-appointed attorney and suggested, without directly accusing, that the representation had been deliberately inadequate. Tate responded with the counter-narrative Wade had been building for a year. Sobriety, stability, employment, community references, a reformed father seeking reconnection with his children after overcoming addiction. His voice was smooth and confident and pitched at exactly the right frequency to convey sincerity to a man who wanted to believe in second chances because second chances were easier than accountability. The morning unfolded like a slow-motion collision. Testimony, counter-testimony. Character witnesses who said Nora was a good mother but tired. Character witnesses who said Wade was a changed man. The system doing what it does, converting human suffering into procedural language and filing it under categories that strip the screaming out of every sentence. Then Eli took the stand. The courtroom shifted. Not the furniture, not the lighting, not the temperature. The air itself changed, the quality of attention. 12 bikers who had been sitting motionless for 2 hours leaned forward by fractions of inches, a collective movement so subtle it was almost invisible, but carried the weight of everything they were. Eli walked to the witness box, sat down, adjusted the microphone with hands that didn't shake. Mac had expected trembling, expected the fragile, fractured voice of a terrified child. What he got instead was something that cracked his chest open. The boy was calm, not the calm of someone who isn't scared, the calm of someone who has been scared for so long that fear has become the baseline and everything above it is just weather. Eli Grayson sat in that witness box the way a soldier sits in a foxhole after the third night, past terror, past adrenaline, deep into the territory of functional numbness, where the body keeps going because stopping isn't an option. Claire began the questioning gently. Name, age, school, living situation. Then she walked him toward it. Eli, can you describe what happens when your father drinks? He locks my bedroom door from the outside. He says it's for my own good. He says I make too much noise and he needs quiet. Sometimes it's a few hours. Sometimes it's all night. And what do you do when you're locked in? I sit on the floor by the door and listen. I can hear everything through the walls. I hear him talking. I hear things breaking. I hear my mom crying when she used to be there. Now I hear him on the phone talking to people, laughing, like nothing happened. The courtroom was carved from silence. Not a cough, not a shifted weight, not a breath that anyone dared release. Has your father ever physically hurt you? He grabs my arm, my wrist. He squeezes until I stop talking. He says if I talk to anyone about what happens at home, he'll make sure I never see my mom or my sister again. Did you tell anyone? I told my teacher. She filed a report. A man from the state came to our house. He talked to my dad. My dad was nice. He smiled. The man left. That night my dad locked me in my room and didn't open the door until morning. Claire paused. Let the words settle into the wood paneling and the fluorescent buzz and the consciousness of every person in the room. Eli, did you tell anyone else? I told the school counselor. She said she'd look into it. She never did. And eventually you went to the Iron Vultures clubhouse. Yes. Why? Eli looked at Mac. Directly. Across the courtroom, past the judge, past Wade, past the attorneys, past the system and the architecture and the flag and the seal. He looked at the scarred, exhausted, guilt-ridden man who had opened a door in a rainstorm and let him in, and he answered with a sentence that broke something fundamental in every biker sitting behind him. Because they were the only people who didn't look away. Mac's hands gripped his knees. His knuckles went white. Beside him, Stitch removed his glasses and pressed his thumb and forefinger against his closed eyes. Jack stared at the floor, jaw trembling. Roach sat perfectly still, but his right hand, the hand that had been steady through 2 combat tours and 58 years of controlled violence, shook once against his thigh before he caught it and forced it still. Tate stood for cross-examination. He buttoned his jacket, adjusted his cuffs, approached the witness box with the measured confidence of a man who dismantled testimonies the way surgeons remove tumors, precisely, clinically, without personal investment in the tissue being destroyed. Eli, you walked 6 miles alone at night to visit a motorcycle club. Is that correct? Yes, sir. And your mother didn't know? No, sir. Did anyone at the club contact your mother before allowing you to stay? Eli hesitated. I don't think so. Not that night. Tate nodded. Let the implication hang. A motorcycle club harboring a minor without parental notification. You mentioned your father locks your door. Does your father's house have locks on the outside of bedroom doors? He uses a chair, wedged under the handle. So there's no physical lock, just a chair. A chair I can't move from inside. But there's no lock. Nothing installed. Nothing permanent. Is that correct? Claire stood. Objection. Counsel is attempting to minimize the functional reality of physical confinement by fixating on the mechanism. Sustained. Move on, Mr. Tate. Tate moved on, but the damage was planted. A seed of doubt dressed as a technicality, placed in the judge's mind for later cultivation. Mac watched it happen with the helpless fury of a man watching someone pick a lock he can't reach. Then Tate shifted. Eli, are you aware that your mother's legal case is being supported by members of the Iron Vultures Motorcycle Club? Yes. And the president of that club, Mr. Mercer, did he talk to you about what to say today? He told me I didn't have to testify. He said whatever I decided was my decision, but he discussed the hearing with you. He told me what to expect, that your job is to try to confuse me. A murmur from the gallery. Tate's composure flickered. A microfracture in the professional mask, quickly repaired. Eli, I understand this is difficult, but I have to ask, is it possible that your memories of these events have been influenced by the people you've been staying with? People who have their own history with your father? Eli's eyes locked onto Tate with a focus that no 13-year-old should possess. The look of a boy who had spent his entire childhood reading adult faces for danger and could identify a predator regardless of the suit it wore. Nobody told me what to say. I'm telling you what happened. If you don't believe me, that's your problem. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Markham called a 30-minute recess. The hallway outside courtroom B was a no-man's land of linoleum and tension. Nora sat on a wooden bench with Claire, reviewing notes. The bikers occupied the opposite wall in a loose formation that managed to be both nonchalant and vaguely menacing simply by existing. Max stood at the window at the end of the corridor. Below, the parking lot held their Harleys and Wade's Mercedes, and the ordinary cars of ordinary people conducting ordinary courthouse business. Title transfers, traffic disputes, the mundane machinery of civic life that continued grinding regardless of what was being decided on the second floor. His phone buzzed. Claire's number. He answered. I'm 30 feet from you. Come to the stairwell. South end, now. Alone. He found her on the landing between the second and third floors. She was holding her phone with both hands. Her face had lost 2 shades of color since the recess began. I just got a call from a source at the sheriff's department, she said. Someone who owes me and doesn't owe Jessup. What? Sarah, Nora's sister. They found something. Not Sarah. A car. Her car. Registered in her name. It was towed from a lot outside Whitesburg 6 months ago and impounded. Nobody flagged it. Nobody connected it to the missing persons case. It sat in an impound yard for 6 months because the detective assigned to Sarah's disappearance never ran the plates. The same detective. The same detective. Officer Dale Kennard, 22 years on the force, promoted to detective under Carl Jessup's tenure. Jessup wrote his recommendation letter. Mac leaned against the stairwell wall. The concrete was cold through his jacket. His breath came in short, controlled bursts. The combat breathing he'd learned in the Marines. The technique that keeps the hand steady and the mind functional when the body wants to shut down. What was in the car? Claire's voice dropped. My source wouldn't say over the phone, but he said enough. He said the car should have been evidence. He said someone made sure it wasn't. Mac looked at her. At the fear underneath the professionalism. At the lawyer who'd taken this case because it was right, and was now staring at something that had metastasized far beyond a custody dispute. We can't use this in court today, Claire said. I don't have documentation. I don't have chain of custody. I don't have anything admissible. All I have is a phone call from a source who could lose his badge for making it. Then what do? We finish the hearing. We make the strongest case we can with what we have. And then we take everything. The police report, the buried domestic call, the car, the detective, the connections to Jessup. And we take it to someone outside this county, state police, attorney general's office, someone Jessup can't reach. And in the meantime, Wade walks out of this courthouse with or without custody of his son, while we wait for a system that's already failed everyone in that courtroom to suddenly start working. Claire held his gaze. Mac, I understand your frustration, but if we push too hard today, if we bring up Sarah, if we accuse Wade of something we can't prove in this setting, Tate will have us sanctioned, Markham will rule against us, and Nora loses everything, not just today, permanently. Max stood in the stairwell between floors, between choices, between the man he wanted to be and the man the situation required. Below him, 12 brothers waited for direction. Above him, a courtroom waited to resume proceedings that would determine whether a 13-year-old boy went back to a house where a woman had disappeared. "There's one more thing," Claire said. Mac waited. "My source told me something about the night Sarah went to Wade's house. The 911 call. There was a second caller." "What do you mean?" "Someone else called 911 from a different phone from inside the same house 3 minutes after Sarah's call. The second call was disconnected before dispatch could log it, but the number was captured. My source ran it." She paused. The stairwell hummed with the distant vibration of the building's heating system, a mechanical heartbeat beneath their feet. The second call came from Eli's phone. The floor shifted under Mac's boots. Not literally, but the sensation was physical. A fundamental rearrangement of everything he understood about the boy sleeping on his couch, the boy who'd walked 6 miles in a storm, the boy who'd just sat in a witness box and spoken with a calm that no 13-year-old should possess. Eli had been there that night, in the house. When Sarah came to confront Wade, Eli had heard whatever happened, had tried to call 911 himself, and had been carrying whatever he witnessed for 9 months without telling a single person. Not his mother, not his teacher, not the school counselor, not Mac, not Stitch, not anyone. A 13-year-old boy had been holding a secret so enormous and so dangerous that the only way to survive it was to bury it so deep that even his own body language couldn't betray it. The calm on the witness stand wasn't courage. It was concealment. The practiced, terrifying control of a child who understood that the information he carried could destroy his father, destroy the case, and potentially put himself in a danger so extreme that walking to a biker clubhouse in a thunderstorm was the safer option. Mac looked at Claire. His voice came out low and fractured. "Does Eli know we know?" "No." "Does Wade?" "I don't know. If Wade knows Eli was awake that night, if Wade knows his son tried to call 911, then this custody fight isn't about getting his son back." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. It's about making sure his son can't talk. Mac walked back into the hallway. His boots on the linoleum sounded different now. Heavier, deliberate, each step carrying the accumulated weight of what he'd just learned. He passed Nora without speaking, past the brothers without meeting their eyes. Walked to the wooden bench where Eli sat alone, legs dangling, feet in the new boots Stitch had bought him, hands resting on his knees with that terrible practiced stillness. He sat down beside the boy, close enough to talk, far enough to give him space. "Hey." "Hey." Mac looked at the far wall, at the courtroom doors, at the seal of Harlan County hanging above them like a promise nobody intended to keep. "You did good in there." "Thanks." Silence. The building breathed around them. Footsteps somewhere on the floor above. A phone ringing in an office down the hall. The small, ordinary sounds of a world that didn't know what was being decided in its margins. Mac wanted to ask. Every instinct screamed at him to turn to this boy and say, "What happened that night? What did you see? What did your father do?" The words sat in his throat like shrapnel, jagged, urgent, desperate to exit. But he looked at Eli's hands, at the practiced stillness, at the fingernails bitten to the quick, at the tiny scars on the knuckles that come from punching walls in the dark when you're locked in a room and screaming would only make it worse. And he swallowed the question. Because asking a child to give up the one secret keeping him alive in a courthouse hallway 20 minutes before walking back into a room with his father was not rescue. It was demolition. And Mac Mercer had demolished enough things in his life to know the difference. He put his hand on the bench between them. Palm down, open. Not reaching for the boy, just available. Eli looked at the hand, looked at Mac, and placed his own hand on the bench beside it. Not touching, not holding, but close enough that the warmth of one could reach the other across the inch of space between them. They sat like that until the bailiff opened the courtroom doors. Inside, Judge Markham called the session to order. Claire and Tate took their positions. Wade sat at his table with the composed posture of a man who had rehearsed for this moment the way actors rehearse. hitting every mark, controlling every expression, projecting the version of himself that the audience was supposed to believe. Max sat in the gallery and watched Wade watching Eli. And for the first time, he saw it clearly, the way Wade's eyes tracked his son, not with love, not with concern, with surveillance, the same constant calculating assessment that a handler performs on an asset, measuring the boy's composure, searching for cracks, trying to determine exactly how much the child knew and how much of what he knew was safe. Wade was afraid of his own son, and that fear was the most dangerous thing in the room. Claire stood. Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to present additional evidence that has come to our attention regarding Mr. Grayson's fitness as a custodial parent. Tate was on his feet instantly. Your Honor, discovery was closed 2 weeks ago. Any additional evidence? This relates to a police report filed 9 months ago documenting a domestic disturbance at Mr. Grayson's current residence. A report that was filed but never forwarded to this court as required by standard procedure in active custody cases. The courtroom went quiet. Not the respectful quiet of procedure, the airless quiet of a room in which someone has just pulled a pin. Judge Markham looked at Claire over his glasses. You have this report? I have a copy, Your Honor, obtained through public records request. She held up a single sheet of paper. The report documents officers responding to a 911 call from a woman inside Mr. Grayson's residence at 2 a.m. Screaming was heard. The complainant was no longer present when officers arrived. No arrest was made. No follow-up was conducted. And critically, the report was never entered into the family court file despite standing orders requiring all law enforcement contacts to be disclosed in pending custody proceedings. Tate's face remained composed, but his hands moved to his briefcase with the reflexive urgency of a man reaching for a weapon. Your Honor, this is a transparent attempt to ambush my client with unverified. The report is an official document filed by the Harlan County Sheriff's Department, Claire interrupted. It bears the badge number, signature, and case notation of the responding officer. Its absence from this court's records is not a matter of verification. It's a matter of suppression. The word hung in the air. Suppression. A word that turns a courtroom from a theater into a crime scene. Judge Markham took the report. Read it. His face remained neutral, but his jaw tightened and his eyes moved over the text with the sharp, focused attention of a man who has just realized the ground beneath his bench might not be as solid as he thought. Mr. Tate, was your client aware of this police contact? Wade leaned toward his lawyer, whispered. Tate straightened. My client acknowledges that officers visited his home in response to a misunderstanding involving a family member. The matter was resolved on scene. No charges were filed. The matter was not resolved, Claire said. The woman who made the 911 call has not been seen or heard from in 9 months. A missing persons report was filed by her family 4 months ago. The investigating officer is the same officer who responded to the domestic disturbance call and failed to forward this report to the court. The silence that followed was absolute, total. The kind of silence that exists at the bottom of deep water where pressure removes the possibility of sound and everything that remains is weight. Wade's composure cracked, not collapsed, cracked. A hairline fracture running through the mask he'd spent a year building. His eyes moved from Claire to Mac to Eli and back, the rapid darting assessment of a cornered animal calculating escape routes. Then his gaze settled on Eli, and Mac saw the boy see his father's eyes. And Mac saw the boy understand what those eyes meant. And Max saw the terror flood back into Eli's face like blood returning to a wound. Sudden, overwhelming, the kind of fear that comes from knowing that the person who hurts you has just realized you might be the reason they get caught. Max stood up, in the gallery, in the courtroom, in front of the judge and the lawyers and the flag and the seal. He stood up because his body refused to remain seated while a child's survival hung on the decisions of men who had already proven they couldn't be trusted with it. Claire shot him a warning look. Sit down, stay quiet, let the system work. But Mac had spent his entire life watching systems work, watching them grind through people like Nora and Eli and Sarah and spit out results that protected the powerful and buried the vulnerable. He'd watched it in the military. He'd watched it in the VA. He'd watched it in this very county for 20 years. And he was done watching. Your Honor, Mac said, His voice filled the courtroom, not loud, not aggressive, but carrying the authority of a man who has nothing left to lose and no reason left to be polite about it. "I'd like to address the court." Judge Markham's gavel hovered. "Sir, you are not a party to these proceedings. Sit down." "I'm a witness, Your Honor, to a pattern, to a history, to a brotherhood that failed a man and then failed his family and is now watching this court prepare to do the same thing. Mr. Mercer, I will hold you in contempt, then hold me in contempt. But let me finish, because that boy sitting in this courtroom knows something that terrifies his father so much that this entire hearing isn't about custody. It's about control. And if you send that child back into that house, you won't be granting visitation. You'll be handing a witness back to the man he can testify against." The gavel came down. Once. Hard. The sound cracked through the courtroom like a rifle shot. "This court is in recess until 2 o'clock this afternoon. Mr. Mercer, you will not return to this gallery. Counsel, my chambers. Now." The bailiff moved toward Mac. Two bikers in the front row shifted their weight. Not standing, not threatening, just recalibrating their center of gravity the way large men do when they're measuring whether the situation requires them to become immovable. Mac raised a hand, settled the brothers with a look, walked toward the courtroom doors with the bailiff at his shoulder and the weight of what he'd just done pressing against his ribs like a hand inside his chest. He'd broken the rules, he'd spoken out of turn, he'd given Tate ammunition, and possibly given Markham the excuse he needed to rule against Nora entirely. But he'd also put the truth on the record. And as he passed through the doors, he looked back one final time and saw Eli watching him from across the courtroom. The boy's face was pale. His hands were gripping the edge of the bench. His eyes were wide and wet and filled with something Mac recognized because he'd felt it himself in moments when the world stripped away every option except the one you've been avoiding your entire life. The look of a person who knows they can't keep the secret anymore. The doors closed, and Mac Mercer stood in the hallway of the Harlan County Courthouse, knowing that in the next 3 hours, a 13-year-old boy was going to have to decide whether to reveal what happened the night his aunt disappeared. And that decision would either save him or put him in more danger than any of them were prepared for. The hallway swallowed Mac whole. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped behind glass. The linoleum reflected his boots in a dull, warped mirror. Distorted shapes moving beneath him as if the building itself was unstable. He walked to the end of the corridor and stopped at the window overlooking the parking lot where 12 Harleys sat in formation and the world continued turning as if nothing inside this courthouse was on fire. The bailiff stayed 10 feet behind, arms crossed, radio on his belt crackling with static that sounded like whispered arguments. "You're not to re-enter the courtroom, sir." "I heard the judge." "I'm making sure." Mac pressed his forehead against the window glass. Cold. The cold felt like the only honest thing in this building. No agenda, no subtext, just temperature doing what temperature does. Below, a squad car had pulled into the lot. No lights, no siren. Just a white cruiser parking at the far end with the deliberate casualness of a vehicle that wanted to be present without appearing to be present. He pulled out his phone, texted Roach, "Squad car in the lot. Unmarked officer. Watch." The reply came in 4 seconds. Already saw it. Kennard. The name landed in Mac's stomach like a swallowed stone. Dale Kennard, the detective. The man who'd buried the domestic disturbance report. The man who'd never connected Sarah's missing persons case to her own car sitting in an impound yard for 6 months. The man who owed his career to Carl Jessup, who was Wade Grayson's blood uncle. Kennard wasn't here for courthouse security. He was here because someone had told him to be. Because the machine that had been protecting Wade for years had just felt the first crack in its foundation and was responding the way machines always respond to structural threats, by sending reinforcements. Mac's phone buzzed again. Claire. Chambers meeting. Markham reviewing this police report. Tate demanding sanctions against me and exclusion of all evidence. I'm holding the line, but this is going to be close. Keep Eli calm. Keep the brothers calm. Do not let anyone leave the building, Mac typed back. Kennard is in the parking lot. A pause, longer than the others. Then, I know, stay inside. He pocketed the phone, turned from the window. walked back down the corridor toward the bench where Eli had been sitting and found the boy standing instead, pressed against the wall between Stitch and Jax like a person trying to make himself small enough to disappear into the plaster. His face was ash white. His hands hung at his sides, fingers curling and uncurling in the repetitive, self-soothing motion of a child whose nervous system was running at maximum output with nowhere to discharge. His eyes tracked every movement in the hallway. The bailiff, the clerk walking past with a stack of files, a woman in a business suit who glanced at the bikers and hurried her pace, cataloging threats with the automated precision of software that never shuts down. "Hey!" Mac crouched in front of him, not kneeling, crouching. The way you lower yourself in a combat zone when you need to talk to someone without making yourself a target. Eye level. Close enough to be heard at a whisper, far enough to give the boy room to breathe. "Is the judge going to send me back?" "No." "You don't know that." Mac held his gaze. "You're right, I don't. But I know that Claire is in that room right now fighting harder than anyone has ever fought for you. And I know that every man in this hallway will stand between you and anything that comes through those doors. That's what I know." Eli's chin trembled, the first visible crack in the composure that had carried him through the witness stand, through Tate's cross-examination, through the moment his father's eyes found his across the courtroom and communicated a threat so familiar the boy's body had responded before his mind could catch up. "He saw me," Eli whispered, "when the lawyer was talking about Aunt Sarah. He looked at me. He knows that I—" The boy stopped, cut himself off mid-sentence with the abruptness of someone slamming a door on their own hand. His mouth closed, his jaw locked. The mask rebuilt itself in real time. A 13-year-old child constructing a psychological barrier out of willpower and fear and the survival instinct that had kept him alive in a house where knowing too much was the most dangerous thing you could do. Mac felt the unfinished sentence hanging between them like a live wire. "He knows that I—" What? Saw? Heard? Called 911? Witnessed something that no child should carry and that no father should create? He didn't push. Pushing would break the boy, and breaking the boy would serve the same purpose as Wade's locked doors and threats. It would take a child's autonomy and crush it beneath the weight of adult necessity. Mac had done that in Fallujah. Kicked down doors, pulled people from rooms, forced information from mouths that didn't want to give it. He knew what it looked like. He knew what it cost. "Listen to me," Mac said. His voice was low, stripped of everything except the raw, unpolished honesty that was the only currency he had left. "Whatever you know, whatever you saw, whatever happened, that's yours. Nobody takes it from you. Not me, not Claire, not that judge. When you're ready to talk about it, you talk about it. Not before. Not because someone needs you to, because you decide to." Eli's eyes filled. He blinked. Once. Hard. Forced the tears back with a physical effort that was painful to watch. Muscles contracting around his eye sockets, jaw clenching, the whole face tightening like a fist. "What if I'm never ready?" "Then you're never ready, and we deal with it." "What if what I know could help?" Mac paused. The question sat between them with the weight of an unexploded ordnance, dangerous to touch, more dangerous to leave. "Then it'll help when you're ready, not before." Eli nodded. Small. Almost imperceptible. Then he sat back down on the bench and placed his hands on his knees in that practiced, terrible stillness. And Max stood up and walked away because staying any longer would have meant watching a child carry something no child should carry and being unable to do anything about it. Stitch fell into step beside him halfway down the corridor. "The boy knows something." "Yes." "About Sarah?" "Yes." "What do we do?" "We protect him. That's all we do. Everything else comes after." Stitch nodded, adjusted his glasses. His hands, steady enough to suture wounds in a combat zone, steady enough to rebuild carburetors in a freezing garage, steady enough to hold the hand of a dying Marine in a helicopter that was taking fire. Those hands were shaking now. Not from fear. From the particular kind of rage that builds in men whose entire identity is organized around healing and who are confronted with damage they cannot repair. "Mac." "Yeah." If Wade gets that boy back, he won't. But if he does... Mac stopped walking, turned to face the medic. The corridor stretched behind them in both directions, empty, fluorescent, humming with the mechanical indifference of a building that had witnessed 1,000 tragedies and would witness 1,000 more. If he does, Mac said, then we stop being the kind of men who sit in courtrooms. The words carried weight that neither of them unpacked. They didn't need to. The understanding was mutual, immediate, and absolute. Some lines, once crossed, cannot be recrossed. Some decisions, once made, redefine everything that comes after. Stitch nodded, walked back to Eli. Mac went to find Roach. The old biker was standing at the window at the south end of the corridor, positioned at an angle that allowed him to monitor both the parking lot below and the hallway behind him simultaneously. Decades of jungle warfare had installed software in Roach's brain that never powered down. Constant threat assessment, constant spatial awareness, constant calculation of distances and angles, and the time it takes a human body to cover ground between point A and point B. Kennard hasn't moved, Roach said without turning around. He's on his phone. Third call in 10 minutes. Who's he calling? Can't tell from here, but his body language changed on the second call. He got out of the car, walked to the trunk, opened it, stood there for 30 seconds looking at something inside, then closed it and got back in. Mac processed that. A detective opening his trunk in a courthouse parking lot during a custody hearing involving a missing woman and a buried police report. The gesture could mean anything. It could also mean something very specific. We need to get Nora and the kids out of this building, Mac said. Roach turned. His face, the mask, the permanent mask, showed something Mac had only seen twice in 15 years. Concern. Not panic, not fear, not surprise. Just the quiet, calibrated concern of a man who has survived enough traps to recognize the geometry of one being assembled around him. Where? Clubhouse first, then somewhere Kennard can't follow, somewhere Jessup can't reach. That's a short list in this county. Then we go outside this county, Roach considered. His fingers drummed once against the windowsill. A single percussive burst, then stillness. I have a contact in Lexington, former marshal. Retired but connected. She handles witness relocation for domestic violence cases through a nonprofit. Off the books. No law enforcement interface. Call her. Already did. 20 minutes ago. She's expecting us. Mac looked at Roach. The old man's eyes held the ghost of a smile. Not warmth, not humor, but the grim satisfaction of a chess player who moves pieces 3 turns ahead of the game. You knew it would come to this, Mac said. I knew it might. That's the same thing at my age. Mac's phone rang. Claire. He answered. Mac listened carefully. Her voice was different, compressed. The professional calm was gone, replaced by something urgent and barely controlled, like a pilot reading instruments that are all pointing in the wrong direction at the same time. Markham has agreed to review the police report. He's taking it under advisement. That's good. But Tate just filed an emergency motion to transfer custody to Wade, immediately pending the court's investigation, arguing that Nora's association with the Iron Vultures constitutes an unsafe environment for the children. Markham is considering it. He can't do that. He can. Emergency custody transfers are at the judge's discretion. If Markham signs it, Wade walks out of this building with legal authority to take Eli today, right now, this afternoon. The corridor tilted. Not physically, but Mac felt the floor shift beneath him the way the ground shifts when an IED detonates 50 meters out and the shock wave reaches your boots before your brain processes the sound. How long? Markham is reviewing in chambers. Could be 30 minutes. Could be 2 hours. I'm fighting it, but Mac, Tate is good. He's reframing everything. Your outburst in the courtroom, the bikers in the gallery, the fact that Eli has been staying at the clubhouse without formal authorization. He's building a case that Nora's support network is actually evidence of poor judgment. So everything we did to help is being used against her. Welcome to family court. The line went dead. Mac pocketed the phone. His hands were shaking. Not from cold, not from fear, from the volcanic, incandescent fury that builds in men who have followed every rule, honored every boundary, done everything the right way, and are watching it all be weaponized against the people they're trying to protect. He walked back to the main corridor, fast. The measured pace was gone. His boots hit the linoleum with the urgency of a man who has just realized the clock isn't just ticking, it's almost out. Brothers? One word, spoken at normal volume. It carried down the hallway and reached every biker in the building the way a signal flare reaches every eye on a battlefield. Instantly, unambiguously, with the implicit understanding that what follows requires immediate attention. They gathered. Stitch, Jax, Roach, Ox, Deacon, Pike, Cutter, Hound, Brim, and three others whose names Mac had barely spoken today, but whose presence he felt like additional vertebrae in a spine that needed every one of them to stand upright. 12 men in leather cuts forming a loose circle in a courthouse hallway with a 13-year-old boy at the center like the thing they were built to surround. Mac spoke low, fast, the briefing voice from Fallujah. 0 fat, 0 repetition, information delivered like ammunition, only what's needed, only what's actionable. Tate is filing for emergency transfer. If Markham signs it, Wade takes Eli today. Claire is fighting it, but the odds are against us. Meanwhile, Kennard is in the parking lot, and he's not here for traffic duty. We need to get Nora and the children somewhere safe. Roach has a contact in Lexington. I'm not running, Nora's voice cut through the circle from behind Mac. She'd been standing in the hallway, unnoticed, overlooked, the way women in crisis are always overlooked by rooms full of men making plans. And she stepped into the circle now with an expression that Mac recognized from combat. The look of a person who has absorbed the full scope of the danger and arrived at the other side of fear in a place where surrender is no longer an option. I'm not running, she repeated. If I run, Wade wins. If I run, Tate tells the judge I fled with the children, and Wade gets custody by default, and a warrant goes out, and I spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. I know how this works. I've been living inside how this works for 8 years. Nora? No. She stepped closer. 5'3", thin, exhausted. Dark circles like bruises beneath eyes that burned with a fire Mac hadn't seen before. Not when they'd knocked on her door, not when they'd filled her kitchen with groceries, not when she'd hugged Eli outside the courthouse. This was different. This was the fire that ignites when a mother understands that every legitimate path to protecting her children has been blocked, and the only option left is the one that requires her to stop being afraid. I have something, Nora said. The circle went still. Sarah called me. The night she went to Wade's house. Before she called 911. She called me first. Mac's breath stopped. She told me she was going to Wade's to talk about visitation. She wanted to negotiate directly, woman to woman. She thought if she could reason with him without lawyers, without courts, maybe things could be simpler. I told her not to go. I begged her not to go. She went anyway because Sarah was like that. She thought she could fix things that couldn't be fixed. Nora's voice cracked. She caught it, held it together with the structural integrity of a bridge that's lost half its supports but refuses to fall. She called me again 40 minutes later, from inside the house. She was whispering. She said Wade had been drinking. She said things had gotten bad. She said she was going to call 911. Then the line went dead. Did you call the police? I called 911 myself. Dispatch told me they'd already received a call from that address, and officers were en route. I gave them my name. I gave them Sarah's name. I told them she was in danger. Nora's jaw tightened. Nobody ever followed up with me. Nobody called me back. Nobody took a statement. The next morning, Wade called and told me Sarah had left. Said she got upset, drove off, went to Virginia to stay with a friend. I didn't believe him. But I couldn't prove anything, and I had 2 children to keep alive and no money and no lawyer and nobody who would listen. She looked at Mac, at the circle of bikers, at the men who had walked into her apartment with groceries and duct tape, and the blunt, imperfect compassion of people who knew what it felt like to be abandoned by every institution that was supposed to help. I've been carrying this for 9 months. I didn't tell Claire because I was afraid. I didn't tell you because I was afraid. I've been afraid every single day since that phone call, and I am done being afraid. The hallway held its breath. 12 bikers and a mother and a boy standing in a courthouse that was designed to process their pain into paperwork and file it away where nobody would ever have to look at it again. Jack spoke first. His voice was raw. That's 3 callers. Sarah called 911. Eli called 911. Nora called 911. 3 separate people reported danger at the same address on the same night, and nothing happened. Not nothing, Roach said quietly. The exact opposite of nothing. Somebody made sure nothing happened. That's not negligence. That's coordination. Mac pulled out his phone, dialed Claire. She answered on the first ring. Nora has a statement. She called 911 the night Sarah disappeared. Dispatch received her call. There's a record. 3 separate callers from or about the same address. Sarah, Eli, and Nora. Dispatch logs are time-stamped. They can't be buried the way a police report can. Silence on the other end. Then Claire's voice, and for the first time since Mac had met her, it carried something that sounded like hope fighting its way through rubble. Get Nora to the conference room on the 3rd floor. I'll bring Markham's clerk. We need a sworn affidavit before Tate can file anything else. And Mac, yeah. The dispatch logs. If they exist, if they haven't been erased, they're the one piece of evidence that can't be attributed to bias or coaching or association with your club. They're objective, time-stamped, generated by a system, not a person. Tate can't discredit a machine. But how do we get them? I need to subpoena the 911 dispatch center directly. That requires a judge's order, which means I need Markham to sign off. And if Markham is part of the machine? Claire paused. Then I go over his head, emergency filing with the state appellate court. I can have it done in 2 hours if I start now. But Mac, if I do that, I'm accusing a sitting county judge of complicity in the suppression of evidence in a case involving a missing woman. That's a bomb. And when it goes off, everyone in this courthouse will feel it, including Nora, including Eli, including you and every brother wearing a patch. Drop the bomb. You're sure? I've been sure since a 13-year-old boy knocked on my door in a rainstorm. Drop the bomb, Claire. He hung up. Turned to Nora. 3rd floor, now. Claire needs your statement under oath. Nora nodded. No hesitation, no fear. The transformation was complete. The exhausted, trembling woman who'd answered her door on a chain 2 days ago had been replaced by something harder, something forged in the specific furnace of a mother who has run out of options and discovered that the last option was herself. Stitch walked with her, steady, present. The corpsman escorting the patient, except this patient wasn't wounded anymore. She was weaponized. Mac looked at Eli. The boy had heard everything. His face was pale, but his eyes were dry, and his hands had stopped their repetitive curling and uncurling. Something had shifted in his posture. The survival crouch loosening, the shoulders pulling back by fractions of degrees, the spine straightening the way a spine straightens when a person decides to stand up instead of fold. My mom is brave, Eli said. Yes, she is. She's braver than me. Mac crouched down again. Eye level, close. She's not braver than you. She's been carrying the same weight you've been carrying. She just decided to put it down. You can too. When you're ready. Eli looked at him. The ancient eyes, the old soul in the young body. The child who had tried to call 911 from inside his father's house on a night when something terrible happened and had kept the secret for 9 months because keeping it was the only form of control he had left in a world that had stripped him of everything else. I'm ready, Eli said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. You already told me that. I'm telling you I'm ready. Max studied the boy's face, looking for the fractures, looking for the signs of coercion or pressure or the desperate eagerness to please that traumatized children develop as a survival strategy. He didn't find them. What he found instead was something quieter and infinitely more durable. The settled, exhausted resolution of a person who has reached the bottom of their fear and discovered that the bottom has a floor and the floor can hold weight. All right, Mac said, let's go upstairs. They moved, Mac and Eli and Jax in a tight formation toward the stairwell. Roach stayed at the window, watching the parking lot, watching Kinnard, watching the chess pieces move on a board that extended far beyond the walls of this building. Ox and Deacon and the others held the hallway. Not blocking, not intimidating, but occupying space with the quiet authority of men who understood that sometimes protection is simply a matter of being large and present and unwilling to move. The third-floor conference room was small, a table, 6 chairs, a window overlooking the back of the building where dumpsters sat against a chain-link fence and a gray cat walked the top rail with the indifferent grace of a creature that has no concept of human legal proceedings. Claire arrived with the clerk, a young woman in her 20s who set up a recording device with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before but never in circumstances like this. Nora sat at the table. Claire sat beside her. The clerk pressed record. Nora spoke, clearly, steadily, every detail of the phone call, the time, the duration. Sarah's voice, frightened, whispering, the sound of a woman who understood that the walls around her were not protection, but containment. The second call, the cut line, the 911 call Nora made herself. The dispatch operator's response, the silence that followed, the morning call from Wade with the Virginia story. 9 months of knowing something was wrong and having no one to tell and no one who would listen. The affidavit took 20 minutes. Then Eli sat down. Claire looked at Mac. Mac looked at the boy. The boy looked at his hands. "Take your time," Claire said. Eli took a breath. Let it out. Took another. His fingers pressed flat against the table, all 10 spread wide, anchoring himself to the surface the way a climber anchors to a rock face before reaching for the next hold. "I was in my room," he said. "My dad put me there after dinner. Locked the door with the chair. I heard Aunt Sarah come in. I heard them talking. It was okay at first. Then it wasn't." His voice was steady, flat, the mechanical narration of a boy who had rehearsed these words in his own head 1,000 times, lying in bed, sitting in class, staring at ceilings in the dark, and was now releasing them into the air for the first time, like animals kept too long in cages. I heard yelling. I heard something break, glass, something heavy. My aunt screamed, once. Then it got quiet. Not good quiet. Bad quiet. The kind of quiet that means something already happened. The recording device captured everything. The clerk's face had gone white. Claire's pen was motionless against her notepad. "I got my phone. My dad didn't know I had it. Mom gave me an old phone for emergencies. I called 911. I whispered. I told them my address. I told them someone was hurt. The call disconnected. I don't know if they heard me." "They heard you?" Claire said softly. "The call was logged." Eli nodded. His hands pressed harder against the table. "I heard my dad on the phone after that. He was talking to someone. Calm, like nothing happened. He said something about a car. He said something about Whitesburg. Then I heard the front door open and close and a truck engine start, and he was gone for a long time." "How long?" "I don't know. Hours. When he came back, it was still dark. He opened my door. He looked at me. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me like he was trying to figure out if I was awake. I pretended to be asleep. He stood there for a long time. Then he closed the door, and I heard him making another phone call. Quieter this time. I couldn't hear the words." Eli looked up from his hands. His eyes found Mac through the silence. "The next morning, he told me Sarah went to Virginia. He smiled when he said it. The same smile he uses when he wants people to believe him. He said if anyone asked about last night, nothing happened. He said it 3 times. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. Like he was teaching me the words." The room was silent except for the soft hum of the recording device and the sound of a gray cat landing on the dumpster lid 3 stories below. Claire stopped the recording, looked at Mac. Her eyes carried the full weight of what they now held. 2 sworn statements, a missing woman, a buried police report, a detective on a former sheriff's payroll, and a 13-year-old boy's testimony describing the aftermath of a crime that an entire county had conspired to erase. "I'm filing with the state court now," Claire said. "Emergency motion. I'm requesting a stay on all custody proceedings, a subpoena for the 911 dispatch logs, and a formal referral to the state attorney general's office for investigation into obstruction of justice by local law enforcement." She stood, gathered her papers, paused at the door. "This changes everything. Not just the custody case. Everything. When Tate finds out, when Wade finds out, The pressure on Nora and Eli will escalate exponentially. You need to get them somewhere safe tonight. She left. The clerk followed. The recording device sat on the table like an unexploded round. Small, unassuming, containing enough force to demolish the architecture of silence that had protected Wade Grayson and the men behind him for years. Max stood at the window. Below, the parking lot had changed. Kennard's cruiser was still there, but a second vehicle had arrived, a black truck with tinted windows parked 2 spaces away. No plates Mac could read from this angle. No movement visible through the glass. His phone buzzed. Roach, second vehicle. Black F250, registered to Cedar Creek Property Management. That's the LLC that owns Wade's rental house. Same LLC traces back to a holding company in Jessup's wife's name. They know, Mac. They're mobilizing. Mac stared at the phone, at the parking lot, at the mountains beyond the courthouse that had watched this valley operate by its own rules for generations. Rules that protected the powerful, buried the inconvenient, and ground the vulnerable into dust beneath the wheels of a machine that called itself justice. He turned from the window, looked at Eli sitting at the conference table with his hand still pressed flat against the surface and his eyes staring at a point on the wall that only he could see. "We're leaving," Max said. "Is it over?" "The hearing is over. What comes next is different." "Different how?" Mac crouched one final time, eye level. The position he'd held more times in this building than he'd held in years of combat. The position of a man talking to the most important person in the room. Different because now they know what you know. And they're going to try to make sure you can't say it again. Eli's face tightened. The fear came back, fast, primal, the survival instinct of a child who has spent his life in the proximity of a dangerous man and recognizes the patterns of escalation the way animals recognize the patterns of weather. "But here's what's also different," Max said. "You're not in that room anymore. You're not behind a locked door. You're not alone with a phone that might not connect. You are standing in a building full of men who will put their bodies between you and anyone who tries to reach you, every single one of them, without hesitation, without conditions." Eli looked past Mac's shoulder, down the hallway, where 12 bikers in leather cuts stood in a loose formation that covered every exit, every stairwell, every line of approach. Not because someone had ordered them into position, but because the instinct to protect had overridden every other impulse in their bodies. "Okay," Eli said. They moved, down the stairwell, through the first-floor corridor, past the courtroom where Judge Markham was reviewing documents that would never look the same after Claire's filing reached the state court, past the bailiff who watched them go with the uncomfortable expression of a man who suspects he's on the wrong side of something but doesn't have enough information to be sure. The front doors opened. Cold air hit them. November, late afternoon. The sky had gone the color of spent ammunition, gray and flat and offering nothing. The Harleys waited. Kennard's cruiser sat in the lot, the black F250 beside it. Both engines off. Both occupied. Mac could see Kennard behind the wheel of the cruiser, phone pressed to his ear, watching the courthouse steps with the concentrated focus of a man receiving instructions in real time. Mac walked Eli to stitch his bike. The medic was already mounted, engine idling, hands steady on the grips. Nora followed, flanked by Jax and Deacon, moving toward a borrowed truck that Ox had brought from the clubhouse, a gray Silverado with tinted windows and plates that didn't trace to anything connected to the Iron Vultures. "Nora and the baby go in the truck," Max said. "Ox drives. Deacon rides shotgun. Stitch takes Eli on the softail. Everyone else, standard formation. We do not stop. We do not engage. We ride straight to the clubhouse, and then we figure out the next move." Engines fired, one after another. The thunder rolled across the parking lot and bounced off the limestone courthouse walls and filled the November air with the deep mechanical growl of 12 machines built for roads that don't forgive mistakes. Kennard opened his car door, stepped out, stood beside the cruiser with his hand resting on his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough to the radio to make a call that would have every patrol unit in the county converging on 12 Harleys before they reached the county line. Mac mounted his bike, kicked the stand, rolled to the parking lot exit, and stopped beside the cruiser. He looked at Kennard. The detective looked back. Mid-40s, hard face, The eyes of a man who had made a series of decisions over the course of a career that had seemed rational at the time and were now arranging themselves into a pattern that looked very much like a conspiracy from certain angles. Detective. Mr. Mercer. Beautiful day for a drive. Kennard's jaw tightened. His hand moved a quarter-inch toward the radio. Stopped. Mac held his gaze. Two men on opposite sides of a line that had been invisible until today and was now drawn in something more permanent than paint. The dispatch logs exist, Mac said, quietly. Not a threat. A fact. Delivered the way facts should be delivered. Without decoration, without emphasis, without anything except the unadorned truth. 3 calls, time-stamped, recorded, on a server that nobody in this county has the authority to erase. A state-level subpoena was filed 20 minutes ago. Your name is on the police report that was never forwarded. Sarah's car sat in impound for 6 months with your case number attached. Kennard's face didn't change, but his hand dropped from his belt to his side. And his eyes, the hard professional eyes of a man who had built a career on knowing which doors to open and which to keep shut. Those eyes flickered with something Mac recognized from the battlefield. The look of a man who has just realized he's standing on the wrong side of the blast radius. Mac rolled forward. The formation followed. 12 Harleys and a gray Silverado pulling out of the Harlan County Courthouse parking lot in the last light of a November afternoon, heading for a clubhouse at the end of a gravel road where a 13-year-old boy who had just shattered 9 months of terrified silence would sleep tonight under the watch of men who had nothing left to offer the world except the willingness to stand between the vulnerable and the dark. Behind them, Kennard stood beside his cruiser and watched them go. He did not follow. He did not radio. He stood there in the cold with his hand at his side and the full weight of 22 years of compromised service pressing down on his shoulders like a physical load. Then he got in his car, started the engine, and drove in the opposite direction. The clubhouse had never been this full. 12 bikes in the lot. The gray Silverado parked at an angle near the front door with its engine still ticking in the cold. Every light in the building burning. The neon beer signs, the overhead fluorescents in the kitchen, the desk lamp in the office, even the porch light that hadn't worked in 6 months until Jax climbed a ladder and replaced the bulb at some point during the afternoon while nobody was watching. Inside, men moved with purpose. Roach was on the phone in the back office, door closed, voice inaudible. Ox stood near the front window with his arms crossed, watching the gravel road disappear into the tree line with the patient focus of a man who could hold a position for hours without shifting his weight. Deacon sat at the oak table cleaning a thermos he'd already cleaned twice, his hands needing occupation the way some men's hands always need occupation after combat. Not because the task matters, but because idle fingers remember things the mind is trying to forget. Nora sat on the couch with her infant daughter asleep against her chest. The baby, Lily, 5 months old, born into chaos and somehow still capable of sleeping through it, breathed in the slow, rhythmic cadence of a creature that hadn't yet learned to be afraid. Nora's hand rested on the baby's back, rising and falling with each breath, and her eyes stared at a fixed point on the opposite wall with the 1,000-yard focus of a woman whose adrenaline had peaked and crashed and left behind a residue of exhaustion so profound it was almost chemical. Eli sat on the floor beside her, cross-legged, hands in his lap. The terrible stillness was gone, replaced by something different, something Mac noticed the moment they'd walked through the clubhouse door. The boy was trembling, not from cold, from release. The 9-month architecture of silence he'd constructed around himself had been dismantled in a third-floor conference room with a recording device and a clerk and a lawyer who wrote down every word, and the demolition had left him shaking the way a building shakes after its load-bearing walls are removed. Still standing, but vibrating with the effort. Stitch sat beside him, not talking, not touching, just present. The medic understood that proximity is its own medicine. That sometimes the most therapeutic thing a human being can offer another human being is the simple, wordless assurance that they are not alone in the room. Max stood on the porch, his 3rd cigarette since they'd arrived. This time, he was smoking it, drawing the heat deep into his lungs and holding it until it burned and releasing it into the November dark and slow, deliberate clouds that dissolved against the black sky. The temperature had dropped below freezing. His knuckles were cracked and raw. His left knee, the one with the pins, throbbed with the deep, persistent ache that cold weather extracted from old metal, like interest on a debt that never decreases. His phone sat in his hand, silent, waiting. At 9:47, it rang. Claire. It's done. Her voice was hoarse, stripped. The voice of a woman who had spent 6 hours in continuous legal combat and had left pieces of herself on the floor of every room she'd entered. The state appellate court accepted the emergency filing. They've issued a stay on all custody proceedings pending investigation. Markham has been formally notified that his handling of the case is under review. The State Attorney General's office has opened a preliminary inquiry into the suppression of the police report and the handling of Sarah's missing persons case. Mac closed his eyes. The cigarette burned between his fingers. Custody? Nora retains full temporary custody effective immediately. Wade's petition is suspended. Supervised visitation denied pending the outcome of the investigation. A protective order has been issued. Wade is prohibited from contacting Nora, Eli, or Lily directly or through third parties. And Wade? Claire paused. When she spoke again, her voice carried the particular weight of information that changes the shape of everything it touches. Wade was taken into custody 45 minutes ago. State police. Not county. State. They executed a search warrant on the Cedar Creek house simultaneously with the custody stay. Mac, they found things. I don't have details yet. My source at the AG's office said the warrant results were sufficient to hold Wade on suspicion of obstruction of justice and potentially more serious charges related to Sarah's disappearance. Mac opened his eyes. The mountains were invisible in the darkness. The gravel lot stretched before him in the pale glow of the porch light, and the Harleys sat in their row like sentinels who had completed their watch and were waiting to be relieved. Kennard? Kennard drove to the state police barracks in Frankfurt at 6 o'clock this evening and requested to speak with an investigator. I don't know what he said, but I'm told he brought documents. Mac remembered the detective standing in the parking lot, the hand dropping from the belt to the side, the look in his eyes, the look of a man calculating the distance between where he stood and where the blast would land. Kennard had done the math. 22 years of compromised service on one side of the scale, the rest of his life on the other, and he'd chosen the only option that didn't end with him buried under the same rubble he'd helped construct. Claire. Yeah. Thank you. A pause, longer than professional. The kind of pause that happens when two people who have been through something together recognize that the words available to them are inadequate for what they're feeling and choose silence instead of pretending otherwise. Tell Nora, Claire said. Tell Eli. They deserve to hear it tonight. The line went dead. Mac finished the cigarette, ground it out on the porch railing, walked inside. Every face turned toward him, 12 bikers, a mother, a boy, a sleeping infant, and the room held its breath the way rooms hold their breath when the person walking through the door is carrying either salvation or ruin, and nobody can tell which until he speaks. Wade's in state police custody, Mac said. Nora keeps the kids. Protective order issued. The investigation is moving to the state level. It's over. The silence that followed wasn't silence at all. It was the sound of 12 men exhaling at the same time. The sound of leather creaking as shoulders dropped and fists unclenched and bodies that had been locked in combat posture for 3 days began the slow, painful process of standing down. Ox pressed his forehead against the window glass and closed his eyes. Deacon set down the thermos and folded his hands on the table and sat perfectly still, and if his eyes were wet, nobody mentioned it because nobody needed to. Jax turned away from the room and walked into the hallway and stood there alone for a minute with his back to everyone, and the sound that came from him was somewhere between a laugh and something else entirely. Nora didn't move. She sat on the couch with Lily against her chest and her hand on the baby's back, and she looked at Mac with an expression he would carry for the rest of his life. Not joy, not relief, not gratitude. Something deeper and more complicated. The expression of a woman who has been drowning for years and has just broken the surface and is taking her first full breath and discovering that air hurts when your lungs have forgotten how to use it. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. Sarah? One word, one name. The only question that mattered. They're searching. The investigation is active. I don't know more yet. Nora nodded. The not knowing was another weight to carry, but this time the weight was shared. Distributed across 12 pairs of scarred hands and a lawyer with a cracked windshield in a system that was finally, slowly, reluctantly, imperfectly, turning its machinery towards something that resembled accountability. Eli hadn't moved from the floor. Mac walked to him, sat down beside him, their backs against the couch, their shoulders almost touching. The wood stove ticked and glowed in the corner, throwing warm light across the scarred floorboards. You heard? I heard. How do you feel? Eli thought about it. Not a quick answer. Not a performative answer. The genuine, effortful consideration of a boy who had spent so long suppressing what he felt that identifying his own emotions had become a skill he needed to relearn. Scared, he said. And something else. I don't know the word for it. You don't need a word for it. You just need to feel it. Eli leaned sideways. Not much. An inch. Maybe 2. Just enough that his shoulder touched Mac's arm. The contact was feather-light, the hesitant, testing pressure of a child who has been conditioned to expect pain from proximity and is experimenting with the possibility that closeness might mean something different. Mac didn't move, didn't lean in, didn't pull away. He held perfectly still and let the boy decide how much contact he could tolerate, the way you hold still when a wild animal approaches. Not because you're afraid of it, but because you understand that trust is built in millimeters, not miles. They sat like that for a long time. The night passed in shifts. Ox and Deacon took first watch. Ox at the front window, Deacon at the back door. Both men accustomed to long hours of vigilant stillness from lives spent working jobs where attention was the difference between going home and going to the hospital. The other brothers filtered out gradually, riding home in pairs, engines fading into the mountain darkness one after another, until the lot held only 4 bikes. Mac's, Stitch's, Jax's, and Roach's. Nora slept on the couch with Lily in the playpen beside her. Stitch had built. Someone had found a portable crib in a storage closet nobody remembered filling, and the discovery had prompted a brief, silent acknowledgement among the bikers that this clubhouse had absorbed the detritus of entire lifetimes without anyone cataloging what was there. Eli slept on the other couch, wrapped in the same blankets from his first night, his breathing deep and even and free of the nightmares that had torn through his sleep 48 hours ago. Stitch sat in the recliner, reading, guarding, the Courseman's eternal post. Max stayed up, not because he couldn't sleep, but because the machinery inside his chest was still running, processing, recalibrating, trying to reconcile the man he'd been 3 days ago with the man he was now. 3 days. 72 hours. A boy's knock on a door and everything that followed. At 4 a.m, Roach appeared in the kitchen. He moved like smoke, present and then not, occupying space without announcing it. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that had been brewing for so long it tasted like motor oil filtered through regret. Handed one to Mac. Sat down at the oak table across from him. They drank in silence. The clubhouse creaked around them. Settling noises, the thermal contraction of old wood and older nails. The building breathing the way buildings breathe when they've stood long enough to develop something that resembles memory. Jessup, Max said. Under investigation. State AG's office served him with a subpoena 2 hours ago. He's not going anywhere, but they want him answering questions before he has time to coordinate stories with anyone. The detective? Kennard turned over 18 months of internal communications. Emails, texts, records of conversations with Jessup going back to when the domestic disturbance call came in. He's cooperating fully. Why? Roach shrugged. The gesture was minimal, the barest elevation of shoulders that had carried 70 years of weight. Because men like Kennard follow power. When the power shifts, they shift with it. It's not courage, it's survival, but the result is the same. Max stared into his coffee. You were right. What you said in the parking lot, about me doing this for myself. Roach's expression didn't change. Was I? Partly. I carried guilt about Wade for 8 years. I saw Eli, and I saw a chance to fix something I broke. That's not nothing. No, it's not. But it's also not the whole thing. Mac looked up. I saw that boy. And I saw every kid who ever knocked on a door that should have opened and didn't. Every Marine I served with who came home to a system that pretended to care and didn't. Every person in this club who ended up here because everywhere else was already closed. I didn't just see Wade's son. I saw all of us. Roach drank his coffee, set it down. His hands, weathered, spotted, scarred across the knuckles from 5 decades of controlled violence, rested on the table with the stillness of objects that have finally reached equilibrium. That's why you're president, Roach said. Not because you're the toughest or the smartest or the most strategic, because you see people, even when you don't want to, even when it costs you. Mac didn't respond. Some things don't need a response. They just need to be heard. The days that followed moved at a different pace, slower, quieter. The urgency that had compressed 3 days into a pressure cooker gradually released, and the clubhouse settled into a rhythm that Mac barely recognized because it wasn't a rhythm he'd experienced before. Not the rhythm of waiting for the next crisis. The rhythm of something being built. Claire handled the legal architecture with the relentless efficiency of a woman who had found a case worth burning for. The state investigation expanded. Forensic teams processed Wade's Cedar Creek house and found evidence that Mac never asked about in detail, because the details belonged to Sarah and to the investigators who would carry them forward. What he knew was enough. Sarah's car in Whitesburg had contained personal items inconsistent with a voluntary departure. The timeline Eli had provided matched physical evidence at the house. The dispatch logs confirmed 3 911 calls on the same night from 3 different sources, exactly as Nora and Eli had described. Wade remained in state custody. His lawyer, Desmond Tate, withdrew from the case within a week, a strategic retreat that spoke volumes about what Tate had known and how quickly he wanted distance from it. A public defender was assigned. Preliminary charges were filed. The process would take months, possibly years. The system moved slowly. But it was moving, and for the first time it was moving in the direction of truth rather than away from it. Nora's apartment on Birch Street was condemned by the county health inspector 3 days after the hearing, a decision that might have been coincidental or might have been a final spasm of the machinery that had been protecting Wade, an attempt to destabilize her housing as retaliation. It didn't matter. The brothers had already moved her. The apartment above Darla's diner had been vacant for 2 years. 3 rooms, clean, warm. Rent that Darla set at a number so low it was functionally a gift, though Darla would have bitten the head off anyone who called it that. The bikers renovated it in 48 hours. Deacon welding a new railing for the staircase, Ox repainting the kitchen, Stitch rewiring a bathroom outlet that had been a fire hazard since the previous tenant. Jax installed locks on every door and window with the focused precision of a man who understood exactly what locks meant to the people who would be living inside them. Nora returned to work at Mercy General. The night shifts continued, but the weight they carried had changed. She walked differently, stood differently. The permanent defensive crouch that had compressed her posture for years began to loosen, vertebra by vertebra, as the weeks passed and the protective order held and the phone didn't ring with Wade's voice on the other end. Eli stayed at the clubhouse. Not permanently, not formally, but in the hours after school and on weekends when Nora was working, the boy gravitated to the gravel lot at the end of the road with the inevitability of water finding its level. He'd arrive on a bicycle that Stitch had rebuilt from parts, the same bicycle that Stitch had deliberately assembled to require ongoing maintenance, so the boy would have a reason to keep coming back, and Stitch would have a reason to keep teaching. The Harley engine project became the center of their shared language. A 1972 shovelhead that Stitch had pulled from a barn in Letcher County years ago and never gotten around to restoring. He and Eli stripped it down to the crankcase in the first week, laying out every component on the garage floor in ordered rows that looked like an archaeological dig. Each piece cleaned, cataloged, assessed for damage, and set aside for repair or replacement. The work was slow, deliberate, patient. The opposite of everything Eli's life had been. And in the space between the turning of wrenches and the smell of degreaser and the sound of Stitch's quiet voice explaining valve timing and bore measurements, something happened that couldn't be measured with tools or documented in court filings. The boy's hands stopped trembling. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But by the 3rd week, when Eli picked up a torque wrench and set a head bolt to spec without checking the manual, His fingers were steady and his eyes were focused, and the practiced stillness that had once been a survival mechanism had transformed into something else entirely: concentration, purpose. The calm that comes from building something instead of bracing for something. Jax kept his distance at first, circling the garage like a satellite in an unstable orbit, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid the gravitational pull of connection. The anger was still there. It would always be there. But it was changing shape, the way metal changes shape under sustained heat, not disappearing but becoming something that could be directed, channeled, used. One afternoon, without announcement or explanation, he walked into the garage and started handing Eli tools before the boy could ask for them. A socket wrench, a gasket scraper, a can of penetrating oil for a seized bolt. The gestures were small, functional, stripped of sentiment. But Eli looked up at him after the third tool and said, "Thanks." And Jax nodded once, and something passed between them that neither would have been able to name and both would remember for the rest of their lives. Spring came the way spring comes to the mountains of eastern Tennessee, not as an event, but as a negotiation. Winter didn't surrender. It retreated in increments, giving back a degree here, a thawed morning there, until one day the dogwoods along the creek road burst into white bloom, and the air smelled like wet earth instead of ice, and the Harleys in the lot caught sunlight on their chrome for the first time in months. Mac noticed the change in himself gradually. The guilt hadn't disappeared. It had reorganized. The 8 years of silence about Wade, the failure to check on Nora and the children, the vote at the table and the closed door and the walkaway, all of it remained. But it had stopped being a wound and started being a scar. The difference was functional. Wounds dictate behavior through pain. Scars remind you of what happened without preventing you from moving. He sat on the porch one evening in early April, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of copper and rust. The air was warm enough to sit without a jacket for the first time since October. Stitch was in the garage with Eli, the shovelhead engine nearly complete now, their voices carrying through the open bay door in alternating registers. The medics low and steady, the boys higher but increasingly confident, increasingly willing to ask questions and challenge answers, and engage in the kind of technical argument that only happens between people who trust each other enough to disagree. Jack sat on the steps below Mac, smoking, watching the road. He'd been quieter lately, not withdrawn, settled. The barbed wire in his chest had loosened enough that he could sit still without vibrating, could hold a conversation without clenching his fists, could sleep through the night more often than not. He'd started attending meetings at the VA in Harlan, not because Mac told him to, but because Stitch had mentioned offhandedly that the Tuesday group had a slot open, and the coffee was decent, and Jax had shown up the following Tuesday without telling anyone. "I talked to my mother," Jax said, not looking at Mac, looking at the road. "First time in 4 years. Mac waited. The sunset deepened. The mountains turned from copper to violet. "I told her about Eli, about the case, about what we did. She cried. Not sad crying. The other kind." He paused, flicked ash from the cigarette. "She asked if I was okay. Nobody's asked me that in a long time." "What'd you tell her?" "I told her I was getting there." Jax turned his head, looked up at Mac. The anger was there, always there, but it was sitting in the back of the room now instead of standing at the front door. "I told her I found people who don't look away." Mac held the look, nodded once. The same small, contained nod he'd given Eli in the courtroom. Acknowledgement without fanfare, recognition without performance. The currency of men who have learned that the loudest declarations of loyalty are usually the least reliable, and that the ones that matter are delivered in nods and gestures, and the quiet act of showing up again tomorrow. Roach appeared from inside the clubhouse carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to Mac, sat in the camp chair he kept on the porch, the same chair he'd been sitting in the night Jax rode to Wade's house, the night everything could have gone wrong if a young biker's rage had outrun an old biker's patience. "Claire called," Roach said. "And?" "Grand jury indictment. Wade. Obstruction of justice. Tampering with evidence. Additional charges pending the forensic results from the house." Mac drank his coffee. Let the information settle. "Jessup?" Suspended from all civic advisory positions, under investigation for abuse of office. His wife's holding company is being audited. The dominoes are falling, Mac. Not fast, not clean, but they're falling. Sarah? Roach was quiet for a moment. The question carried weight that couldn't be measured in legal terms. Sarah was the absence at the center of everything. The woman who'd walked into a house to try to fix something unfixable and had vanished into the silence that this county had been manufacturing for years. The investigation is active. The forensic team is still processing the Cedar Creek property and the impound vehicle. Claire says the AG's office is treating it as a priority. It wasn't an answer. It was the space where an answer would eventually go. And Mac understood that some spaces take longer to fill than others, and that the waiting is itself a form of respect for what was lost. He looked out at the lot. The Harleys gleamed in the last light. The dogwoods along the fence line were in full bloom, white blossoms catching the breeze like small flags of surrender planted by a winter that had finally run out of fight. The screen door opened behind him. Eli stepped onto the porch. His hands were black with engine grease. His boots, the same boots Stitch had bought from the Goodwill on Route 7, were scuffed and worn in the way that boots get worn when they're used for real work by a person who has somewhere to stand. He was carrying something. A wooden box about the size of a hardcover book, sanded smooth and stained dark. On the lid, burned into the wood with the careful, uneven hand of someone learning the craft for the first time, was the Iron Vulture's insignia, the spread-winged bird that decorated the back of every cut in the club. Eli set the box on the porch railing in front of Mac, stepped back. His hands hung at his sides, grease-stained, steady. Stitch showed me how to do the burning. Took me 3 tries to get the wings right. Mac looked at the box, ran his thumb across the insignia. The burn marks were imperfect, slightly uneven, one wing longer than the other, the letters beneath the bird not quite aligned. Imperfect the way real things are imperfect, the way people are imperfect, the way a brotherhood is imperfect, and a family is imperfect, and a boy is imperfect, and still, somehow, enough. Eli. Yeah. Mac reached into the inside pocket of his cut. He'd been carrying the item for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment, not knowing what the right moment would look like until it arrived and looked exactly like this. A boy with grease on his hands standing on a porch at sunset with the mountains behind him and the sound of a shovelhead engine turning over in the garage for the first time in 30 years. He pulled out a small leather patch, hand-stitched, the size of a playing card. On it, in thread that Darla had sewn because Darla's hands were the steadiest in the county, were 3 words. Honorary Little Brother. Mac held it out. Eli looked at the patch, at Mac, at the patch again. His lip trembled, one tremor, brief and violent, the last aftershock of a seismic shift that had been rearranging the interior landscape of a 13-year-old boy for the past 4 months. He took the patch, held it in both hands, pressed it against his chest the way a person presses a hand against a wound to stop the bleeding, except this wasn't stopping anything. It was starting something, the beginning of a story that belonged to him and not to his father, and not to the system, and not to the county, and not to the silence. Thank you, Eli said. His voice cracked on the second word. He didn't try to hide it, didn't clench his jaw, didn't rebuild the mask. He let the crack stand open and visible and human. And in that small act of vulnerability, in the willingness of a damaged boy to be seen as damaged instead of performing invincibility, Mac Mercer saw something he hadn't seen in a very long time. The future. Not a clean future. Not a guaranteed one. Not a future free of nightmares or courtrooms or the long, grinding work of healing from things that should never have happened. But a future that existed. A future that was possible. A future built on the foundation of scarred hands and imperfect men, and a knock on a door in a rainstorm and the simple, irreducible act of answering. The garage door opened fully. Stitch walked the shovelhead into the fading light on a rolling stand, chrome catching the last sun, engine warm, exhaust ticking in the cool air. The old machine gleamed with the resurrection of months of patient labor. Every gasket replaced, every bearing packed, every surface cleaned and oiled and brought back from the edge of oblivion by a medic's steady hands and a boy's determined ones. The brothers gathered without being called, drifting toward the lot the way they always drifted, drawn by the sound of an engine, by the smell of exhaust, by the gravitational pull of machines and men, and the spaces between them where something unnameable lives. Jax brought wood for the barrel fire. Deacon lit it. The flames climbed into the darkening sky and threw warm light across the gravel, and the chrome and the faces of men who had been broken and rebuilt and broken again and rebuilt again until the breaking and the rebuilding became the same process, and the process became the point. Nora arrived after her shift, still in scrubs, Lily on her hip. She walked into the lot and stopped at the edge of the firelight and looked at her son standing among the bikers with the leather patch pressed against his chest, and grease on his hands, and an expression on his face that she hadn't seen in years and had been afraid she'd never see again. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She walked to Mac and stood beside him and watched the fire and the bikes and the boy and the mountains going dark against the first stars. And the silence between them was not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of things understood. Later. Much later. After the fire had burned down and the brothers had gone home, and Nora had driven back to the apartment above the diner with Eli drowsing in the passenger seat and Lily asleep in the back, Mac sat alone on the porch. One last cigarette. The gravel lot empty except for his Harley and the sound of the creek running behind the tree line, fed by snowmelt from mountains that had watched everything and held their silence because that's what mountains do. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He answered, breathing on the other end. Different from last time. Not performed, not threatening, ragged, broken. The breathing of a man sitting in a concrete room under fluorescent lights with nothing left between himself and the truth. Mac. Wade's voice, but not the Wade from the phone call 4 months ago. Not the strategic, calculating, weaponized voice of a man wielding the system like a blade. This voice was stripped, hollowed. The voice of a man who has hit the floor and discovered that the floor is the only honest surface he's touched in years. I'm in a program, Wade said. 30 days. Court ordered, but I asked for it. I asked for it before they ordered it. Mac said nothing. Listened. The creek ran. The stars turned. I can't fix what I did. I know that. I know what I am. I know what I became. A pause, thick, wet. The sound of a man swallowing something that won't go down. But I need you to know, when they find Sarah, when they find out what happened, it wasn't what I... His voice broke. Fully. The sound of a human being collapsing inward under the weight of what they've done and what they've lost, and the distance between those two things. Mac held the phone. The cold pressed against his face. The cigarette burned between his fingers. He thought about the boy who'd knocked on his door, about the woman on the couch, about the infant who slept through storms, about Sarah, still missing, still unaccounted for, still occupying the space between known and unknown, where hope and grief live in the same room and take turns sitting in the only chair. 30 days, Mac said. 30 days. One day at a time, Wade, the road's still open. He didn't know if he meant it. He didn't know if redemption was possible for a man who'd done what Wade had done. He didn't know if the words were mercy or reflex or the last echo of a brotherhood that had been broken beyond repair. But he said them. Because some things need to be said, not because they're true, but because the person hearing them is drowning, and words are the only rope available, and the alternative to throwing the rope is watching someone go under. And Mac Mercer had watched enough people go under for one lifetime. The line went silent. Not disconnected, just silent. 2 men holding phones in the dark. One on a porch in Tennessee, one in a facility somewhere beyond the county line. Breathing in the same night air separated by miles and years, and the wreckage of choices that could never be unchosen. Mac ended the call, set the phone on the railing, finished the cigarette, ground it out. He stood, stretched. His knee popped. His shoulder ached. His body cataloged its complaints the way it always did at the end of long days, the accumulated invoice of a life spent using itself as a tool and a weapon and a shield for people who needed shielding. He walked to his Harley, threw a leg over, sat there for a moment without starting the engine, just sitting, feeling the weight of the machine beneath him and the cold of the hand grips and the particular quality of silence that exists in a gravel lot at the end of a road, at the edge of a mountain town, at the bottom of a night that holds no more emergencies. He started the engine, The Harley rumbled to life, a sound like a heartbeat amplified through steel and chrome, and the accumulated miles of a machine that had carried him through everything and asked for nothing except fuel and maintenance and the occasional forgiveness for parts that wore out. He rolled down the gravel drive, turned onto the road. The headlight cut a narrow tunnel through the darkness, and the mountains rose on either side like walls built from something older than stone, and the road unwound before him in the way that roads do when you're not running from anything and not chasing anything, and the riding itself is the destination. Behind him, the clubhouse light stayed on. Stitch had forgotten to turn it off, or maybe hadn't forgotten. Maybe he'd left it on the way people leave lights on in windows. Not for themselves, but for anyone who might be out there in the dark, looking for a door to knock on, looking for a place where the people inside don't look away. The light burned, small and steady against the vast Tennessee night, and somewhere on the road between the clubhouse and town, Mac Mercer rode through the dark on a machine that had never promised him anything except forward motion, and he understood, not as philosophy, but as fact, as lived and bleeding and bone-deep truth, that salvation doesn't arrive through saints or systems or the machinery of justice that grinds so slowly it sometimes forgets what it was built to grind. Sometimes it arrives at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, barefoot, shaking, 13 years old, knocking on the only door that was still open.